Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we'll be tracing the long, bleak journey of a plant that promised sleep and delivered ruin, opium. Before we wander through this catalogue of intoxication, commerce, and quiet collapse, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair plus other sleep tools in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. Opium has always carried a poetic name. The ancients called it the sleep bringer, a title that made it sound like a kindly spirit rather than a resin scraped from the scored head of a flower. It comes from the poppy, a plant that looks innocent enough when its petals are swaying in the sun, but whose sap has outlasted empires. For 5,000 years, men and women have taken this sticky substance, hoping it might silence pain, hush grief, or deliver peace. And for 5,000 years, they have discovered that peace comes at a cost no one quite wants to calculate until it is far too late. The pattern is brutally consistent. First, it is medicine, revered as a cure handed down by gods or science. A few drops calm the screaming child, soothe the broken limb, or steady the trembling hands of the elderly. Soon that medicine slips into something more indulgent, a means to chase pleasure, to drift further into haze than necessity alone might require. Pleasure turns into dependency, the body quietly rearranging itself so that life without opium feels unbearable, and dependency hardens into ruin, whether that ruin arrives as a collapsed household, a wasted body, or an entire society hobbled by its own intoxication. What changes are the costumes. Clay jars in temples, brown bottles on Victorian shelves, syringes in battlefield tents, or packets slipped across borders. The cycle itself remains the same. Every empire has rehearsed this tragedy with a slightly different accent. The Sumerians carved its praises into clay, the Greeks catalogued it with the same rational precision they applied to geometry, and the Victorians poured it into glass bottles labelled for coughs. Each culture imagined it was using opium more wisely than the one before, and each in turn learned that wisdom has very little effect on addiction. Politicians condemned it while quietly profiting, doctors warned against it while prescribing it liberally, and poets embraced it while writing odes to their own slow collapse. In every age, the flower's gift has looked like a miracle in the morning and a curse by nightfall. To understand how the cycle began, we return to the earliest civilizations that left their marks on clay tablets, where the poppy first took root in human history. The Sumerians gave the plant a name that was as honest as it was damning: Hulgil, the joy plant. They were the first to tend the neat rows of poppies that stretched along the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, their petals nodding in the hot sun like conspirators in some ancient bargain. From these fields came the sticky resin that would one day fuel empires, topple dynasties, and leave millions in quiet collapse. But for the Sumerians, there was little grandeur in it. They treated the poppy as they treated grain, cattle, or date palms. Another crop that could be harvested, measured, and exchanged. What made this plant unusual was not its shape or its yield, but the way its sap softened pain and coaxed the weary into silence. That was enough to earn it reverence and fear in equal measure. The clay tablets that survived from Sumer and Akkad read like the first drafts of humanity's medical handbook. Scratched with blunt reeds, they list remedies for toothaches, fevers, colic, and childbirth, and again the poppy reappears as an ingredient. The instructions are rarely elaborate. A crushed seed mixed with water, a drop of resin dissolved in beer, an infusion left to steep overnight. The results were never exact, since one pod might ooze more potency than another, but even in this imprecision lay power. Mothers discovered that a little of the juice calmed restless infants. Priests found that it quieted the moans of the sick long enough to conduct their rites. Midwives, crouching in stifling huts beside groaning women, administered the sleep bringer to soften labour's agony. The joy plant did not heal, it muffled. And in a world where most ailments had no cure, muffling was miracle enough. It is tempting to imagine these treatments as clinical, detached, but the Sumerians lived in a cosmos where medicine and magic were inseparable. A fever was not simply a rise in body temperature. It was the hand of a demon pressing down on the flesh. To drive it out, one needed both chant and poultice. The poppy's resin therefore entered not just the physician's bag, but the temple storehouse, tied to incantations and offerings. Tablets describe mixtures prepared under certain stars, seeds ground while names of gods were spoken, and saps poured into bowls, while prayers asked for release from suffering. Whether one believed in the chants or not, the sap did its work, all the same. In that way, opium began its long history of accommodating every belief system that claimed it. As the Sumerians faded, and the Babylonians and Assyrians rose in their place, the poppy's reputation endured. Merchants carried it up and down the rivers, trading it alongside lapis, wool, and grain. By the time caravans wound their way into Egypt, the plant was already established as a quiet commodity, useful and profitable, but not yet notorious. Egypt, however, gave it a broader stage. The Nile Valley, rich in its own crops and luxuries, embraced the poppy as both medicine and trade good. Archaeologists have uncovered jars and vials in tombs, still faintly stained with residue, as though their owners expected to need relief from pain, even in the afterlife. In frescoes, you sometimes glimpse petals carved or painted, small details amid larger scenes of harvest and banquet. It was not the centerpiece of Egyptian medicine, but it was present, a whisper in the background of daily life. Egyptian physicians were not fools. They catalogued herbs and minerals with astonishing precision, writing treatises that would guide medical thought for centuries. Among their prescriptions, opium appears as a component in treatments for headaches, insomnia, and digestive trouble. As in Sumer, its role was not to cure, but to quiet. For infants especially, the resin was a blessing. A few drops smeared onto the gums of a screaming child could bring silence, a relief as much for the parents as for the infant. To a modern ear, it sounds reckless, even cruel, but to a people with no antibiotics, no vaccines, and little patience for endless crying, it was a gift. That those same drops sometimes silenced a child forever was a risk quietly absorbed into the rhythm of life. Trade magnified its presence. Egypt was less an island than a hub, and along the Nile flowed goods destined for the Levant, the Aegean and beyond. Opium, dried into cakes or stored in sealed jars, travelled with them. The scent of resin mixed with frankincense, myrrh, and cedar oil in caravans that creaked across deserts and docked at Mediterranean ports. To foreign merchants, it was one more exotic product among many, but word of its effects spread faster than the jars themselves. By the time Greek sailors and traders encountered Egyptian medicine, the reputation of the poppy had already acquired an aura of ancient legitimacy. It was not merely a plant, it was a treasure of the old kingdoms, sanctified by tombs and temples, and therefore safe to trust. One can picture the scene: a Greek visitor, sweating in the Egyptian sun, stepping into a shaded chamber where jars line the shelves. He watches as a scribe dips a reed into a clay pot, mixes the contents with honey, and explains in careful words that this will bring rest, that it will drive away pain. The visitor may not know the precise workings of the body, but he knows relief, when he sees it. He takes the mixture, perhaps smuggles a sample home, and tells his compatriots that the Egyptians possess a potion worthy of study. From there, the plant story drifts westward again, carried not by seeds alone, but by the authority of Egypt's reputation. The Sumerians may have named it, and the Egyptians may have refined its trade, but both left the same essential legacy: opium as a tolerated companion to human suffering. It was not yet a scourge, not yet the centre of wars and prohibitions, but already it showed its dual nature: a healer that never healed, a comforter that demanded more comfort in return. When the Greeks began to absorb Egyptian medicine into their own philosophy, they carried not only jars of resin, but the beginnings of a cycle that would play out again and again. For them, the poppy would become a subject of reason and speculation, folded into theories of humours and balance. The sleep bringer was about to leave the temple and the tomb and enter the lecture hall. And so the story continues, drifting north across the Mediterranean, where Greek physicians would record their observations with the same confidence as their predecessors, convinced that they understood the plant more thoroughly. In truth, they were stepping into the same pattern: medicine, pleasure, dependency, ruin, only dressed in the language of philosophy rather than ritual. But that comes next. For now, the poppy has been cut, the resin collected, and the jars shipped. From the banks of the Nile, its journey into the wider world begins. The Greeks never met a substance they could not fold into philosophy. Wine became a discourse on moderation, honey a lesson in dietetics, and the poppy's resin, sticky and bitter, was no exception. Hippocrates, the man who insisted that disease was not the work of capricious gods, but of natural causes, treated opium with the same blunt rationalism he applied to every other material. In his surviving texts, there is no incantation, no appeal to divine favour, only clinical observation. The poppy juice could still the bowels, calm coughing, and ease pain. It could also cloud the senses and disturb digestion. He listed these things as though he were drafting a set of building instructions, never mind that the substance was already centuries deep in human ritual. For Hippocrates, it was simply another tool. Medicine, he argued, should be based on what was observed to work, not on superstition. And what he observed was that opium worked sometimes too well. Greek physicians who followed him treated the resin with similar detachment. To them, the human body was governed by humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and illness resulted when those humours fell out of balance. Poppy juice fit neatly into this system. Categorised as cooling and drying, a counterbalance to fevers and inflammations. The logic was elegant, if entirely detached from the real mechanisms of chemistry. Still, patients who swallowed the bitter concoctions found their coughs suppressed, their aches dulled, their restless nights softened by drowsiness. In an age when surgical tools were crude and infections unstoppable, such results were enough to justify its place in the physician's kit. Whether the explanation was right or wrong hardly mattered. Relief, even temporary, was proof enough. By the time the Romans inherited Greek medicine, the poppy was already part of the intellectual furniture. Galen, the empire's most influential physician, practiced in the 2nd century CE and left behind volumes of texts so expansive that medieval scholars would still be citing him 1,000 years later. To Galen, opium was both indispensable and dangerous. He prescribed it for pain, diarrhea, insomnia, and melancholy, always with elaborate warnings about dosage. In his view, the drug was powerful enough to quiet pain, but treacherous enough to extinguish life outright. He wrote with the authority of one who had seen both outcomes. His case notes make clear that poppy juice was often the line between suffering and silence, but also between silence and death. The physician who wielded it needed judgment, though judgment often faltered when desperation pressed harder than caution. Outside the libraries and lecture halls, opium seeped into daily Roman life in quieter ways. Apothecaries sold it as part of compound remedies, blending it with honey, wine, or vinegar to disguise its acrid taste. Wealthy households stocked it in their medicine chests, alongside salves, poultices, and dried herbs. Soldiers on campaign carried it in crude flasks, doled out by physicians who had little else to offer the wounded. A legionary slashed open by a barbarian blade might be given poppy juice to dull the agony, while a comrade bound the wound with rags. Relief was temporary, but in war, temporary was often the best anyone could hope for. The juice did not heal torn flesh or ward off fever, yet it allowed a soldier to endure the march to the next encampment, or more grimly, to drift into oblivion when nothing else could be done. The battlefield offered endless opportunities for the poppy to prove its worth. Roman military campaigns dragged across continents, from the misty forests of Britain to the scorched deserts of the Near East. In every climate, soldiers faced wounds, infections, and the gnawing pain of forced marches. The poppy's resin, dissolved into wine, was a universal prescription. Accounts survive of doctors rationing doses carefully, knowing the difference between easing pain and sending a man into fatal stupor was a matter of drops. Veterans returning home might remember the bitter taste as the difference between torment and endurance. Some, no doubt, sought it again in civilian life, a quiet echo of what would one day be called addiction. Not everyone was convinced the plant was a gift. Greek and Roman writers alike left scattered warnings about its dangers. Dioscorides, the first-century pharmacologist, whose De Materia Medica would guide Europe for centuries, noted that too much opium caused lethargy, confusion, and even death. He catalogued varieties of poppy, distinguished between their seeds and sap, and admitted their potency was unpredictable. The advice was pragmatic: use sparingly, avoid excess. The fact that such caveats had to be repeated suggests that excess was already common. People knew the line between remedy and poison and crossed it anyway. The temptation was too strong, the relief too immediate, the haze too inviting. The warning stood, largely unread, as the cycle of medicine to indulgence to dependency played out on a smaller, quieter scale within Roman streets and homes. Meanwhile, Roman society absorbed the poppy into its broader culture of consumption. This was a civilization of banquets, baths, and indulgences, where moderation was praised in theory and ignored in practice. Wine was watered or fortified according to taste. Feasts extended late into the night. Perfumes masked the smell of decay in crowded streets. Against this backdrop, opium fit naturally. It could be taken to ease the aftermath of excess, or to enhance the descent into sleep after revelry. For some, it may even have carried an air of sophistication, the mark of one who dabbled in the wisdom of Greek medicine. If dependence followed, it was hidden under the same veneer of refinement that covered so many Roman vices. Yet for all its presence, opium was never the central intoxicant of the classical world. Wine held that crown, cheap and abundant, the daily drink of peasants and patricians alike. Opium remained more specialised, a tool of doctors, soldiers, and those wealthy enough to afford apothecaries' wares. This relative scarcity perhaps spared the Mediterranean from the kind of widespread devastation that later centuries would know. Still, the groundwork was laid. The knowledge of the poppy's power had been formalised in texts, woven into medical systems, and normalised within daily life. It had become both trusted and feared, indispensable and suspect, a contradiction that would shadow it forever. When Rome's empire began to fracture under invasions, corruption, and exhaustion, its libraries and scholars scattered. Cities were sacked, households burned, but the medical texts endured, copied by monks, translated by scholars, passed hand to hand. Among the fragments that survived, Galen's writings stood paramount, carrying with them his ambivalence toward the poppy. Useful, dangerous, irresistible. The collapse of Rome did not end the poppy's journey, it simply changed its route. Where legions once marched, caravans now plodded, their camels swaying under loads of silk, spices, gems, and less visible cargo wrapped in cloth or sealed in jars. Among the bundles of pepper and sacks of cinnamon, cakes of dried opium resin travelled eastward, a quiet companion to more flamboyant luxuries. The Silk Road was never a single highway, but a web of paths that wound through deserts, mountain passes, and trading cities. Along these routes, the resin of the poppy passed from hand to hand, each exchange inflating its value and reshaping its reputation. By the time it arrived in distant markets, it was no longer just medicine. It was rumour, luxury, and myth, each layer of storytelling coating it more thickly than the resin itself. Merchants were skilled salesmen long before the word existed, and they understood that mystery could be as profitable as rarity. A small vial of poppy juice from the Mediterranean might be presented to a buyer in Samarkand as a secret elixir of ancient wisdom, guaranteed to bring sleep, banish coughs, and sharpen thought all at once. The truth, that it dulled pain and muddled the mind with equal efficiency, was less marketable than a tale of hidden kingdoms and forgotten gods. Traders embroidered their descriptions with details that grew more elaborate the farther they travelled. A drop of resin became a charm against nightmares. A paste of poppy seeds was said to quicken the imagination. In a world where distance itself made objects precious, opium carried an aura of the exotic, its bitterness transformed into allure by nothing more than geography. Its uses multiplied with every new culture it touched. In Central Asia, healers incorporated it into herbal concoctions alongside familiar roots and barks, trusting that what was prized in distant lands must hold virtue. In Persia, physicians debated its effects, weighing stories brought by traders against their own observations of patients who grew drowsy or silent after swallowing the mixture. Along the oases of the Taklamakan Desert, where weary caravans paused to rest, opium could be bought and sold like any other spice, its presence as unremarkable to the merchants as the jingling of camel bells. Yet to those who sampled it, its reputation grew. Its ability to still pain made it seem divine, and its power to induce dreams lent it an air of mystery that even skeptical physicians found difficult to dismiss. The journey along the Silk Road did more than spread the substance. It magnified the contradictions that had always clung to it. A Roman soldier might have known poppy juice as a crude battlefield anesthetic. A healer in Kashgar might encounter it as a wonder imported from lands beyond the horizon, imbued with properties more magical than medical. The further it travelled, the less connected it became to sober medical texts, and the more it was wrapped in legend. Some called it a sacred gift, others a dangerous temptation, but few dismissed it outright. In trade hubs where goods from China, India, and the Mediterranean collided, the poppy was simply another piece of the puzzle, one more exotic fragment in a tapestry of exchange that linked empires through shared appetites. Caravan life itself ensured that opium found constant use. Journeys stretched for weeks across barren landscapes, where cold nights gnawed at bones and dust storms flayed the skin raw. Merchants, guards, and travellers alike sought relief from cramps, fatigue, and fever. A few drops of resin dissolved into wine or water could dull the misery enough to keep the caravan moving. In such conditions, the distinction between medicine and indulgence was meaningless. Survival justified anything, and if a man grew dependent on the poppy during the march, that was his burden to carry once the journey ended. The important thing was that he reached the next trading post alive. The poppy, as always, proved useful, if never without cost. It was not only individuals who benefited from its passage. States and rulers noticed the profits that could be made from taxing or controlling its trade. Caravanserais, the fortified inns that dotted the Silk Road, were as much customs houses as shelters, where duties were levied on every parcel. The more prized the good, the higher the toll. Opium, riding the same caravans as silk and spices, became entangled in this web of commerce. It was not yet the backbone of any empire's revenue, but it was a reliable contributor. Another reason for rulers to encourage the constant movement of goods across their lands. As always, profit softened moral hesitation. If the resin carried risk, that risk was borne by others, far away. The tax collector only saw the silver it brought to his coffers. Cultural exchange accompanied the trade in goods. Poets in Persia composed verses that described sleep as a kind of poppy dream, borrowing imagery that linked the flower to tranquility and forgetfulness. In Central Asian folklore, tales circulated of travellers who carried small cakes of resin to ward off evil spirits of the night. Whether these spirits were real or imagined, the result was the same. Opium gained an identity beyond medicine, woven into metaphor and myth. To dream was to wander in the fields of the poppy, and to suffer was to cry out for its juice. Its presence became literary as well as physical, a symbol of the universal desire to escape pain and drift into stillness. For physicians who tried to anchor the substance in observation, these myths posed both a challenge and a lure. Some attempted to strip away the legends, to measure and record effects as systematically as possible. They noted that opium stopped diarrhea, eased coughing, and dulled pain. They also observed that patients who took too much slipped into stupor or never woke at all. The contradictions mirrored those already recorded by Hippocrates and Galen centuries earlier, proof that the cycle of recognition and warning was continuing without interruption. The myths kept spreading, but the sober notes of caution persisted, written down in medical treatises that travelled alongside the caravans. It was the Islamic scholars who would eventually bring greater order to this knowledge. The expansion of the Islamic world in the 7th and 8th centuries gathered together lands once scattered, from Spain across North Africa, through Persia into Central Asia. With this expansion came libraries, translation projects, and a renewed appetite for systematizing medicine. The texts of Galen and Dioscorides were translated into Arabic, and local physicians added their own observations. Opium was no longer just an exotic good carried by traders. It was a subject of careful study. Scholars like Avicenna would weigh its properties with precision, acknowledging both its capacity to heal and its danger when misused. The poppy had completed its long journey from the Mediterranean into the intellectual centres of the Islamic Golden Age. Avicenna, the Persian polymath whose canon of medicine would dominate European medical thought for centuries, described opium as one of the most powerful substances known. He recognized its capacity to ease pain, calm coughing, and induce sleep, but he did not mistake it for harmless. His texts caution that the drug in small doses may be beneficial, while in large doses it is lethal. He went so far as to call it a poison, placing it alongside other dangerous materials whose utility depended entirely on restraint. Avicenna's clinical clarity made him unusual in a tradition that often blurred the line between medicine and superstition. To him, opium was a substance to be respected but feared, a tool for the skilled and a trap for the careless. He was not alone in this assessment. Other physicians of the era echoed his warnings. Al-Razi, another towering figure of medieval medicine, described opium as effective but treacherous. He noted that patients who used it repeatedly grew dependent, their bodies demanding more for the same effect, a phenomenon that would not be formally named for nearly 1,000 years. Al-Biruni, a scientist whose curiosity extended from astronomy to pharmacology, wrote of the poppy's juice as an anesthetic but stressed the danger of excess. These scholars were among the first to articulate, in systematic language, what had long been apparent in practice. Opium provided relief, but relief always carried a shadow. Their attention to detail was not purely academic. The Islamic world at this time stretched across continents, encompassing deserts, fertile river valleys, mountain strongholds, and bustling ports. Its physicians faced a dizzying variety of ailments, from the fevers of the tropics to the chills of mountain winters, and they needed remedies that could be relied upon. Opium, when measured carefully, became a useful part of their arsenal. Surgeons preparing to lance an abscess might dose a patient to dull the agony. Midwives could administer it sparingly during difficult births. Pharmacists sold small amounts from jars carefully labelled. Their contents weighed on scales no less exacting than those used for gold. It was never presented as a cure-all, but as a potent option for moments of true need. That it was also quietly misused outside professional hands was a reality few could deny. Indeed, the warnings preserved in scholarly texts suggest that misuse was already common. While physicians emphasized moderation, the broader public often preferred results over caution. A man with a chronic cough might take a little more than prescribed, finding that larger doses brought not only silence, but a pleasant fog. A woman weary from endless labour might seek repeated doses to dull not just her physical aches, but her daily despair. For the poor, opium was difficult to obtain in quantity, but for the wealthy, access was easier, and indulgence followed. The cycle of medicine, pleasure, dependency, and ruin unfolded in miniature within households and communities, even as scholars laboured to classify and warn. Knowledge was preserved, but wisdom was ignored, just as it had been in Greece and Rome. What distinguished the Islamic Golden Age was the commitment to documentation. Unlike earlier cultures, where remedies were scattered among clay tablets or temple inscriptions, here they were gathered into encyclopedias, medical handbooks, and pharmacopoeias. These works, meticulously copied and transmitted, ensured that opium's properties, both its benefits and dangers, were preserved in a systematic form. That preservation mattered far beyond the Islamic world itself. When Europe staggered through its long medieval malaise, often losing track of the medical texts it once inherited from Rome, it was the Arabic translations that safeguarded the knowledge. Monks in European cloisters might remember scraps of Galen, but it was through Arabic intermediaries that his full texts, enriched with Islamic commentary, returned centuries later. The warnings of Avicenna and his contemporaries became, indirectly, Europe's warnings too. In daily life, the poppy remained less prominent than alcohol or hashish, substances that played larger roles in the cultures of the Middle East. Yet it was never absent. In markets from Cairo to Isfahan, apothecaries offered their mixtures in small vials, the contents ground with spices or dissolved into syrups to mask the bitterness. To the passerby, these were simply medicines, one option among many, but the reputation of opium was more ambiguous. Some considered it indispensable, others too dangerous to touch. The ambiguity itself was part of its endurance. A drug powerful enough to be both admired and distrusted could never be entirely ignored. That duality also shaped the way opium appeared in literature and philosophy. Poets used the poppy as metaphor, equating sleep with the flower's embrace, describing oblivion as a field of nodding heads. Mystics interpreted its effects as symbolic of the search for divine union, to leave behind the body's pain and drift into higher states of awareness. Physicians rolled their eyes at such flights of fancy, but the imagery stuck, embedding opium not only in medicine, but in culture. Even where its physical use was limited, its symbolic use spread, another sign that the plant had insinuated itself into the human imagination as well as the human body. Despite these warnings and metaphors, abuse was never eradicated. Accounts survive of rulers, courtiers, and scholars themselves succumbing to excess, dosing themselves into stupor under the guise of treatment. Physicians might write soberly about moderation, but in practice they sometimes ignored their own advice, drawn to the same escape they cautioned against. It was, perhaps, inevitable. When pain pressed hard enough, when grief refused to fade, when sleeplessness hollowed out the nights, even the most rational mind could justify another drop of resin. The cycle that had unfolded in Sumer, Egypt, and Rome replayed itself here, proving once again that knowledge does little to restrain appetite. Still, the act of cataloguing mattered. Without it, much of what was known in antiquity might have vanished into the gaps of history. By preserving, translating, and expanding the medical literature, Islamic scholars ensured that opium's story would not begin anew with every civilization, but continue as a thread of continuity across ages. Their notes on dosage, their warnings about dependency, their acknowledgement of both relief and danger. All of this would pass eventually into European languages, where it would shape the next chapters of the drug's long career. That their cautions would often be ignored did not negate their importance. It only underscored the tragic consistency of human behaviour when faced with a substance that promised both peace and peril. When Europe slipped into the long dusk of the Middle Ages, much of the old knowledge seemed to wither on the vine. Cities shrank, literacy waned, and medicine retreated into the hands of monks, itinerant healers, and apothecaries whose shops smelled of herbs, smoke, and animal fat. Yet even in this dim light, the poppy did not disappear. It trickled back into Europe through the same channels that carried spices, silks, and fragments of learning. Trade routes from the Mediterranean, contact with the Islamic world, and the copying of ancient texts in monastic scriptoria. You would not find it everywhere, and certainly not in the abundance that wine or ale commanded, but in the right jar on the right shelf, behind counters darkened by candle smoke. The resin of the poppy waited quietly for its next patient. Apothecaries were the keepers of this continuity. Their jars contained dried leaves, roots and powders, each carefully labelled in Latin, each carrying a mixture of observation, superstition, and tradition. Among them, small containers held opium, sometimes imported directly, sometimes compounded into tinctures with honey, vinegar, or spirits. To the layperson, the shop itself was overwhelming, a place where every ailment seemed to have a cure, provided you trusted the man behind the counter and had the coin to pay him. To the trained eye, however, the presence of opium was less dramatic. It was simply one more item in the repertoire, useful for calming pain, soothing coughs, or lulling restless children. Its potency was acknowledged, but its place was modest. This was not a drug that defined the age, but one that survived it. The monks who tended infirmaries also knew of the poppy, though their records often blurred the line between practical treatment and divine intercession. Herbal manuscripts copied in cloisters included recipes for soporifics that combined poppy seeds, or juice with wine, honey, or other herbs like henbane and mandrake. These concoctions could be used to ease the suffering of the sick or to prepare a patient for crude surgery. In such settings, opium was rarely administered in isolation. It was one note in a chorus of ingredients, chosen as much for symbolic associations as for physiological effect. The monk might pray over the mixture as he offered it, the patient drifting into uneasy sleep while the chanting echoed in the background. Compared to alcohol, however, opium never gained broad cultural dominance in medieval Europe. Beer and wine were cheap, abundant, and socially acceptable, woven into daily life, to the point where even children drank them as safer alternatives to water. The poppy, by contrast, remained rare, expensive, and faintly exotic. It was too costly for peasants, too specialised for most households, and too strongly associated with apothecaries to become a staple intoxicant. Where the tavern was the heart of communal life, the apothecary was a place of private consultation, a quieter realm of whispered complaints and measured doses. Opium in this context was not a shared pleasure, but a private remedy, closer to secrecy than celebration. Yet secrecy did not mean absence. Medieval medical compendia, such as the Antidotarium Nicolai, widely circulated in Latin Christendom, included references to preparations containing poppy. Recipes instructed the careful mixing of seeds or resin with wine or vinegar, dosed sparingly for fevers or sleeplessness. Physicians who trained in the universities of Salerno or Montpellier learned of the drug through texts translated from Arabic, their knowledge second-hand, but their trust in its effects real. For them, the poppy was a matter of inheritance, a substance described by Galen, refined by Avicenna, and therefore worthy of inclusion in their own teaching. It carried authority because it came from tradition, not because it was widely experienced firsthand. Surgery in this period offered one of the few occasions when opium's stronger powers were summoned. Medieval surgeons, armed with knives, saws, and cautery irons, needed ways to quiet their patients before cutting into flesh. Crude anaesthetic recipes survive, often called soporific sponges, which were soaked in mixtures of wine, mandrake, henbane, and sometimes opium. The sponge was held to the patient's nose until drowsiness or unconsciousness followed, though the line between sedation and death was perilously thin. Success meant a quieter surgery. Failure meant a corpse. In either case, the poppy's reputation as a powerful ally of the surgeon was reinforced. Its presence in these mixtures ensured it remained part of the medieval imagination, even if most people never tasted it themselves. Despite this knowledge, misuse and dependency never reached the scale seen in other eras. Part of this was simple economics. Opium was too expensive to be consumed habitually by the majority. What little circulated tended to remain in the hands of physicians, monks, and the wealthy. There may have been individuals who sought it out repeatedly, enchanted by its ability to soften the hard edges of life, but their stories rarely appear in the surviving records. Medieval chroniclers were more interested in sins of the flesh, disputes over heresy, or miracles than in cataloguing the slow collapse of a man dependent on poppy juice. If such lives unfolded, they were largely invisible, hidden behind the walls of homes or the jars of apothecaries. The cultural imagination of the time also shaped its reception. While Islamic scholars wrote about opium with the precision of pharmacologists, European writers often folded it into the symbolic landscape of medieval thought. The poppy flower appeared in bestiaries and herbals as an emblem of sleep, forgetfulness, or even death, its drooping head a natural metaphor for the descent into silence. In illuminated manuscripts, its petals might be painted alongside depictions of other plants. More decoration than prescription, the drug itself remained largely confined to those who practiced medicine, while the flower became a symbol that any monk with a brush could appreciate. It is striking, in retrospect, how muted the role of opium was in this era, where later centuries would be shaken by waves of dependency and entire wars fought over its trade. Medieval Europe treated it almost as an afterthought, a medicine stored in jars beside cinnamon and saffron. This does not mean it was unimportant. Rather, It underscores the degree to which the continent's energies were absorbed elsewhere, by plague, by famine, by war, and by the ceaseless rhythms of agricultural survival. Alcohol dulled those realities on a communal scale, while opium remained a specialist's tool, employed at the margins where pain pressed hardest. Yet even in its modesty, the poppy endured. Monks copied manuscripts, apothecaries measured doses, physicians taught students, and surgeons risked their patients' lives with soporific sponges. Each act kept alive a thread of continuity, stretching back to Sumer and Egypt. The names of Galen and Avicenna were whispered in Latin classrooms, their authority lending weight to recipes that otherwise might have been dismissed as superstition. The poppy sap, tucked away in jars behind counters, was still part of Europe's medical inheritance, waiting quietly for an age that would pay it far more attention. When Europe began clawing its way out of the Middle Ages, it rediscovered not only art and architecture, but also its appetite for experimentation. Alchemy, medicine, and philosophy overlapped in ways that would seem muddled to modern eyes, but in the 16th century, they were all part of the same restless pursuit to discover the hidden properties of matter. Few embodied this spirit more vividly than Theophrastus von Hohenheim, better remembered by the grandiose name he gave himself, Paracelsus. He was a man who despised the old authorities even as he quoted them, who wandered across Europe collecting knowledge like a magpie, and who mixed substances with a confidence that suggested inspiration rather than caution. For Paracelsus, the boundaries between cure and poison were negotiable, provided he could find the right recipe. Among the ingredients he favoured, the poppy held a prominent place. Paracelsus was fascinated by the idea that small doses of dangerous substances could heal rather than harm. He argued that the dose makes the poison, a maxim that would echo through medicine long after his death. Opium fit neatly into this framework. Everyone knew it was powerful, even lethal, but that very potency suggested it might also contain extraordinary benefits if properly managed. Paracelsus experimented with combining it not with honey or vinegar, as had been common for centuries, but with alcohol. Spirits were becoming increasingly available in Renaissance Europe, distilled into fiery clarity in taverns and laboratories alike. To dissolve the resin of the poppy into strong alcohol was to create something at once more stable, more palatable, and more potent than the crude mixtures of monks and apothecaries. He called it laudanum, borrowing from the Latin laudare, to praise, as though the drug itself deserved applause. The effect was striking. Alcohol carried the opium deep into the body, enhancing and prolonging its effects. Laudanum soothed pain more effectively than older tinctures, eased coughing, and stilled sleeplessness with an efficiency that seemed almost miraculous. To patients who had endured the blunt instruments of medieval surgery, the bitter infusions of herbs, and the endless prayers that did little but prolong suffering, laudanum felt like the arrival of a gift. To physicians seeking prestige in a competitive age, it was an emblem of modernity, proof that science, alchemy, medicine, whatever name one preferred, was uncovering truths that the ancients had only glimpsed. For Paracelsus, it was vindication, a demonstration that his willingness to break with tradition had borne fruit. Like many of Paracelsus's concoctions, the recipe for laudanum was neither fixed nor simple. He added saffron, crushed pearls, and assorted herbs, insisting that these additions enhanced the mixture's virtue. His admirers copied his formulas with reverence, though none could agree on the precise proportions. What mattered was not the exact recipe, but the reputation. The word laudanum became synonymous with a potent cure, the details shifting according to the apothecary or physician who prepared it. What was consistent was the presence of opium, dissolved in alcohol, carried into the bloodstream with a speed and reliability that earlier mixtures had lacked. The bitter taste was disguised with spices, and the fiery bite of spirits reassured patients that they were consuming something vigorous and effective. By the mid-16th century, laudanum had begun to spread beyond Paracelsus's own circles. Physicians in Germany, Italy, and France experimented with their own versions, some more elaborate than others, but all built around the same principle. Alcohol and opium together created a medicine far stronger than either alone. Patients swore by it, reporting relief from ailments that had tormented them for years. It was prescribed for fevers, headaches, melancholy, gout, digestive troubles, and almost anything else a physician might be asked to treat. The breadth of its supposed usefulness only enhanced its reputation. In an era when few treatments did more good than harm, laudanum seemed to be the exception, the long-sought miracle that every doctor craved. The enthusiasm was not entirely without caution. Even Paracelsus admitted that opium was dangerous if taken in excess, and physicians who prescribed laudanum too liberally sometimes found their patients slipping into fatal sleep. But the Renaissance was not an age inclined toward restraint. Exploration, invention, and ambition carried more weight than moderation, and laudanum's dangers were overshadowed by its promise. Deaths could be blamed on improper dosing, on weak constitutions, or on unrelated illnesses. The drug itself retained its aura of wonder. Patients clamoured for it, physicians advertised it, and apothecaries stocked it in small glass bottles that gleamed invitingly behind their counters. In the courts of Europe, laudanum became a fashionable remedy, whispered about by courtiers and prized by nobles. It was not just medicine, it was a mark of sophistication, proof that one had access to the newest marvels of science. A lady at court might sip it discreetly to calm her nerves before a banquet, while a nobleman might dose himself to ward off sleepless nights or nagging pains. The association with Paracelsus, the notorious innovator, gave the tincture an air of intellectual daring. To use laudanum was to align oneself with the cutting edge of medicine, to show that one was above the crude remedies of the peasantry. The bitter taste was endured as a badge of refinement, proof that one could stomach what the ignorant would reject. Meanwhile, in the bustling cities, laudanum circulated through apothecaries who packaged it with a salesman's flair. Bottles were labelled with Latin inscriptions, their contents presented as precious and rare. Prices reflected the aura of luxury, ensuring that only the well-off could afford regular use. Yet demand only grew. The Renaissance appetite for spectacle and novelty extended to medicine as well as art, and laudanum became part of the performance. Physicians who offered it could expect gratitude and fees. Patients who consumed it could expect relief and admiration. The cycle reinforced itself, each success story magnified in the telling, each failure quietly forgotten or excused. The deeper truth that laudanum did not cure but only suppressed was easy to overlook amid the excitement. A fever subdued by laudanum often returned once the effect faded. Pain dulled by the tincture flared again when the dose wore off. Sleepless nights postponed by a draught eventually returned, demanding another. Dependency grew quietly in the background, but dependency was not yet a recognised category. A patient who demanded laudanum again and again could be dismissed as particularly afflicted, rather than as ensnared by the very cure meant to relieve them. Physicians might notice, but they were rarely inclined to question a remedy that worked so reliably in the short term. Paracelsus himself, restless as always, moved on to other experiments, but laudanum outlived him. His reputation as a maverick ensured that his concoction carried a certain notoriety, But the drug itself proved too effective to fade into obscurity. By the time of his death in 1541, the tincture was firmly established across much of Europe. Generations of physicians who followed would refine it, debate its composition, and prescribe it with a confidence that bordered on zeal. It became in effect the first modern opiate, a preparation that married the old knowledge of the poppy with the new enthusiasm for distilled spirits, creating something more potent and more seductive than either tradition alone could have imagined. The Renaissance prided itself on rediscovering the wisdom of antiquity, but in laudanum it created something distinctly new. This was not simply Galen's poppy juice or Avicenna's careful dosage. It was a reimagined substance dressed in the language of alchemy and promoted as a miracle of modern science. That its dangers were ignored or minimized was in keeping with the spirit of the age, which valued boldness over prudence, innovation over restraint. Laudanum, like the Renaissance itself, was dazzling, seductive, and reckless. By the 17th century, laudanum had slipped neatly into the routines of Europe's elites. A nobleman might begin his morning with a spoonful to settle his stomach after a night of indulgence, while a lady might dose herself discreetly before a long carriage ride to quiet her nerves. Apothecaries stocked it in ornate bottles that looked more like perfume flasks than medicine, and physicians prescribed it with a confidence bordering on evangelism. The tincture, once the eccentric experiment of Paracelsus, had become not only respectable, but fashionable. Where the Middle Ages had treated the poppy as a marginal remedy, the early modern period made laudanum a household word, though the households were usually those of the wealthy who could afford both the medicine and the doctor to supply it. The appeal was obvious. Laudanum seemed to offer relief for almost everything. It calmed fevers, softened coughs, eased indigestion, stilled trembling hands, and soothed the restless. In a period when medical understanding was still guided more by tradition and theory than by evidence, a drug that produced consistent, observable results was priceless. Physicians reached for it readily, prescribing it to patients across a spectrum of complaints. To the aristocrat suffering from melancholy, laudanum was the balm of choice. To the merchant weary from endless travel, it was the quickest route to sleep. To the anxious mother of a colicky infant, it was a godsend, though one laced with danger she could not yet name. Every ailment seemed to justify another spoonful, and each spoonful made it easier to reach for the bottle again the next time discomfort intruded. In the bustling cities of Europe, laudanum was not confined to noble chambers. Apothecaries in London, Paris, and Amsterdam sold it to anyone who could pay. Their advertisements, painted on signboards or printed in pamphlets, presented it as a panacea. For cough, colic, cramps, and melancholy, they promised, with a flourish that concealed the drug's darker side. The bitter taste was masked with spices and wine, making it easier to swallow. Housewives purchased it for their families, convinced it was a safer alternative to the harsher remedies on offer. Sailors carried it on voyages as protection against seasickness and sleeplessness. Even clergy, who might have condemned drunkenness in the tavern, had no qualms about recommending laudanum for suffering parishioners. The line between cure and indulgence blurred, and few paused to question whether reliance on the tincture might be breeding a new form of misery. Dependency crept in quietly, without a name. The concept of addiction, as we know it today, did not exist, and those who found themselves reaching for laudanum again and again were simply thought to be unusually frail, melancholic, or prone to recurring illness. A gentleman who carried a bottle in his coat pocket might excuse it as prudence, while a lady who refused to travel without her tincture could dismiss it as a necessity for her delicate constitution. In truth, both were ensnared by the same cycle. Relief followed by return of symptoms, followed by greater need. The drug did not cure but postponed, and with each postponement, the craving for postponement grew stronger. Writers of the time occasionally remarked on the phenomenon, though rarely with the urgency it deserved. Some described acquaintances who seemed to waste away, dosing themselves daily until their skin grew sallow and their energy ebbed. Others noted the peculiar dullness in those who consumed laudanum too frequently, a lethargy mistaken by some for piety or calm. But these observations were scattered, isolated murmurs amid a chorus of praise. The tincture's benefits were too evident, its risks too easily dismissed. Physicians who might have recognized patterns of dependency often chose to ignore them, partly because laudanum kept patients quiet, and partly because it bolstered their own reputations as healers. Better a patient subdued than a patient restless, whatever the cost in the long term. As the 17th century wore on, laudanum became entwined with the broader rhythms of society. It was taken before balls and assemblies to steady nerves, after funerals to soften grief, during pregnancies to ease discomfort, and in sick rooms to quiet those on the brink of death. The association with refinement only deepened, until it was difficult to distinguish the tincture from the rituals of polite life. A bottle might be displayed on a parlour shelf beside fine glassware, a symbol of both medical prudence and social status. To own laudanum was to demonstrate that one had access to the best that modern science and commerce could offer. That it carried silent costs mattered little in a culture where appearance often outweighed reality. Yet beneath the surface, stories accumulated. Servants whispered of masters who could no longer sleep without their nightly draught, of mistresses who grew pale and listless after months of dosing themselves daily. Apothecaries noticed familiar faces returning more often than seemed reasonable, coin always at the ready. Some physicians muttered about laudanum eaters, those who had fallen into habitual use. But the phrase carried little stigma. It was no more scandalous than being overly fond of wine, and perhaps even less so, since laudanum retained the respectability of medicine. Dependency was hidden in plain sight, cloaked in Latin prescriptions and ornate glass. The tincture's reach extended beyond the domestic sphere into politics and commerce. Statesmen carried bottles during long journeys or tense negotiations, valuing the calm it provided in moments of stress. Soldiers in garrisons dosed themselves to sleep through pain or tedium. Traders moving along Europe's rivers and roads found laudanum as common in apothecary shops as pepper or cloves. The drug's portability made it ideal for a continent increasingly tied together by trade and correspondence. A bottle that could travel from Florence to London without spoiling was as much a commodity as it was a medicine, and it began to circulate accordingly. By the dawn of the 18th century, laudanum was so entrenched in European life that it no longer felt new. It had become routine, a background presence as ordinary as bread or wine. This very ordinariness masked its dangers even further. A society that had survived plagues, famines, and wars had little patience for moral panic over a medicine that seemed to do more good than harm, and yet the seeds of something larger were being sown. The same networks of trade that carried laudanum across cities would soon be stretched across oceans. The same apothecaries who sold bottles to aristocrats and merchants would soon compete with vast companies moving opium on a global scale. The tincture that had once been Paracelsus's miracle now pointed towards something darker. Not just a medicine for individuals, but a commodity capable of reshaping nations. The early modern era had embraced laudanum with enthusiasm, treating it as both cure and fashion, medicine and ornament. Its dependency remained largely invisible, its dangers softened by the glow of respectability, but the story was about to shift again. By the 18th century, opium would no longer be confined to jars on apothecaries' shelves or bottles in aristocrats' parlours. It would move into the warehouses of empires, traded by ships and taxed by states, transformed from tincture to global commodity. What began as an experiment in a Renaissance laboratory would soon become a matter of imperial policy, with consequences far beyond the walls of any sick room. The East India Company was not founded to sell drugs, but it quickly discovered there was no profit more reliable. What began as a merchant enterprise chartered to trade spices and textiles mutated over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries into an imperial leviathan. By the time its influence stretched across the Indian subcontinent, the company had become less a business and more a sovereign power, complete with armies, tax systems, and ruthless efficiency. Among its many ventures, the cultivation of opium poppies proved especially lucrative. Unlike pepper or cloves, which had to be sourced from distant islands, poppies could be grown on land directly under company control. Unlike silks or porcelains, which required careful handling, opium resin could be packed into chests and shipped with little risk of spoilage. The sleep bringer had always promised relief. In the hands of empire, it promised profit. Vast fields of poppies soon carpeted the fertile plains of Bengal and Bihar, their pale petals nodding under the sun. Farmers, coerced into contracts with the company, were forced to cultivate poppies instead of food crops, ensuring that hunger grew in step with the narcotic trade. The arrangement was simple and brutal. The company provided advances and seeds, dictated how much land must be devoted to poppies, and then purchased the resin at prices it set itself. The farmers bore all the risk. The company reaped the rewards. Reports survive of peasants driven into debt, their bellies empty, while their fields bloomed with flowers destined for export. For the officials in Calcutta, this suffering was irrelevant. What mattered was that the warehouses filled with opium cakes, each one a brick of revenue that could be taxed, traded, and smuggled. The scale of production was staggering. By the late 18th century, millions of pounds of opium were processed annually, under company supervision. The resin was carefully standardized into chests weighing around 140 pounds each, stamped and sealed to guarantee authenticity. Auctions in Calcutta determined which private traders would carry the chests onward. But the system was tightly controlled to ensure the company's monopoly remained unchallenged. Opium had become an industrial product, as uniform as cloth or gunpowder, its value calculated in ledgers rather than measured in lives. The poppy fields of India were no longer local remedies but global engines, feeding a trade whose consequences would stretch far beyond the subcontinent. For Britain, the profits were irresistible. Taxes on opium funded administrative costs, military campaigns, and the steady enrichment of shareholders back in London. The drug was not consumed on a wide scale in Britain itself. Laudanum remained the domestic form, neatly bottled and sold in apothecaries. But overseas, opium became a lever of empire, a commodity that could balance trade deficits and secure Britain's dominance in Asia. The company's directors spoke of commerce, efficiency and duty, but beneath the rhetoric lay a simple calculation. Opium was the one product they could always sell, regardless of law, morality, or the suffering it left in its wake. The buyers, increasingly, were in China. For centuries, European merchants had coveted Chinese goods, tea, silk, and porcelain, without finding products of equal appeal to offer in exchange. Silver drained from Europe into China in alarming quantities, enriching the Qing dynasty while impoverishing Western coffers. Opium offered a solution. Though initially discouraged or banned, the drug found eager customers among Chinese smokers, who blended it with tobacco in long pipes that turned evenings into clouds of fragrant haze. Demand grew steadily, and British traders, with the company's backing, supplied it with ruthless regularity. Chests of opium left Calcutta and sailed across the Bay of Bengal, arriving in Canton, where smugglers distributed them, despite imperial prohibitions. Each transaction shifted the balance of trade back toward Britain, replacing silver with resin, and each sale deepened China's vulnerability. Within India, the human toll was immense but largely invisible to the shareholders who profited from it. Peasants starved when food crops gave way to poppies. Communities dependent on subsistence farming collapsed under the weight of debt imposed by company contracts. Famines struck with greater ferocity, worsened by the fact that fertile land was tied up in narcotic cultivation rather than sustenance. None of this appeared in company reports, which measured success in revenue streams and tax receipts. The farmers were expendable, the flowers were not. Imperial rhetoric might speak of civilization and progress, but in practice the empire's advance was watered by hunger and sealed with resin scraped from poppy pods. The sheer profitability of the trade blinded many to its consequences. Company officials in India and parliamentarians in London alike defended the cultivation of opium as a matter of necessity, a pillar of commerce that supported Britain's global position. Critics who raised objections, missionaries disturbed by addiction in China, reformers alarmed by the misery in India, were dismissed as sentimental or naive. Commerce, after all, had no patience for morality. To oppose the opium trade was to oppose prosperity itself, and prosperity, in the imperial lexicon, justified everything. It was the same logic that had excused slavery and conquest, now applied to a flower that withered lives as efficiently as any musket. The opium auctions in Calcutta became spectacles of imperial capitalism. Merchants gathered to bid on the sealed chests, their fortunes rising and falling with the hammer's strike. The resin, once measured in drops and spoonfuls, was now stacked in warehouses like coinage, each chest a unit of imperial wealth. From there it moved onto ships bound for Canton, disguised at times, brazen at others, depending on how firmly Chinese officials attempted to enforce their bans. Smuggling was not an unfortunate byproduct, but the system itself, woven into the very fabric of the trade. British merchants learned that laws could be bent, officials bribed, and local networks exploited, all in the service of turning poppy resin into silver and silver into tea. By the close of the 18th century, the system was fully in motion. Farmers in Bengal bled under contracts they could not escape. British coffers swelled with silver that once flowed only into China, and smugglers in Canton ensured that imperial prohibitions were little more than words on paper. Opium had become the hinge of empire, a commodity that fed Britain's appetite for tea while hollowing out China's strength. For London and Calcutta, the trade was prosperity. For the Qing dynasty, it was an encroaching disaster. To see the scale of that disaster, we must turn now from the company's counting houses to China itself, where smoking opium was spreading from the gilded halls of courtiers into taverns, garrisons, and villages, and where the first warnings of collapse were already in the air. Opium did not arrive in China in its most destructive form all at once. For centuries, small amounts had been imported from Southeast Asia, used occasionally in medicine or mixed into food. It was a curiosity rather than a crisis. The turning point came in the 17th century, when tobacco, newly carried across the seas from the Americas, swept into China. Smoking quickly became a fashionable habit among elites, its aromatic clouds drifting through parlours and courtyards. Someone at some point decided to add opium resin to the mix. The result was potent and seductive. The tobacco provided a sharp stimulation, while the opium softened the body and wrapped the mind in a warm haze. Among courtiers and aristocrats, this blend became the height of refinement, a ritual of luxury carried out with carved pipes, delicate lamps, and embroidered cushions. What began as a medicinal resin swallowed in pills had become a smoke inhaled for pleasure, and that shift would change everything. At first, the practice was confined to the wealthy. Smoking opium with tobacco was expensive, and the paraphernalia itself, pipes carved from ivory or jade, lamps made of polished brass, was as much a display of status as a means of intoxication. In these rarefied settings, opium smoking was framed as a civilized indulgence, something to be savoured alongside poetry, music, and flirtation. The smoke curled through salons like incense, masking the drug's darker nature behind the trappings of culture. As with laudanum in Europe, the respectability of the practice was guaranteed by the patrons who embraced it. If the nobility smoked, it could hardly be seen as shameful, but habits cultivated in elite chambers rarely stay confined for long. Merchants, soldiers, and officials adopted the practice, carrying it with them into the taverns of provincial towns and the garrisons of border outposts. The ritual that had once belonged to silk-robed courtiers now spread to artisans, farmers, and even beggars. By the 18th century, smoking opium had seeped into every stratum of society. The appeal was obvious. It dulled fatigue, blunted hunger, and brought warmth to cold nights. In crowded cities, it offered escape from the press of labour and poverty. In rural villages, it provided a brief reprieve from endless toil. Wherever it spread, it left behind the same quiet dependency. A habit begun as a mark of refinement had become a craving that gripped rich and poor alike. The physical toll was plain to see. Chronic smokers grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, their skin sallow, their movements slow. Labourers could not endure long days in the fields. Soldiers lost their stamina, and entire households fell into decline as wages were spent on smoke rather than sustenance. Families fractured under the strain. Wives sold heirlooms to buy resin for husbands who could not go without it. Children went hungry while fathers reclined in stupor. The sweet, cloying smell of opium drifted from homes and dens alike, announcing not comfort but collapse. What had once been pitched as leisure and sophistication now revealed itself as a force of erosion, corroding both body and society. Opium dens became common fixtures in urban life. These rooms, dim and heavy with haze, were furnished with low couches and scattered cushions, designed for endless hours of reclining. Lamps glowed softly as resin bubbled, pipes passed from hand to hand, and the silence was broken only by the murmured conversation or the faint cough of a smoker. Time seemed suspended within those walls, hours dissolving into dreamlike stupor. Outside, markets bustled and carts rattled across stone streets, but inside, the world narrowed to smoke, heat, and oblivion. For those who entered, the dens offered temporary reprieve. For those waiting outside, their families and communities, the dens represented absence, idleness, and ruin. The social costs mounted quickly. Military officials warned that soldiers were weakened, unable to march or fight with the vigour expected of them. Local magistrates complained of farmers abandoning fields, their energy spent on securing the next pipe. Moralists condemned the practice as decadent, a betrayal of Confucian ideals of duty and discipline. Yet the habit spread faster than condemnation could contain it. For every warning issued, another household discovered the relief of smoke. The Qing dynasty, governing a vast and populous empire, struggled to confront a vice that had insinuated itself into every class and every province. The problem was not isolated, it was systemic, an addiction woven into the daily rhythms of life. Imperial officials responded with bans. As early as the 18th century, edicts were issued forbidding the smoking of opium, denouncing it as harmful to health and destructive to society. Smugglers were to be punished, dens shuttered, and smokers disciplined. At first the bans were mild, framed as paternal warnings from the throne. Later, as the crisis deepened, they became harsher, prescribing public humiliation, confiscation of property, even execution for repeat offenders. Yet the decrees were undermined at every level. Local officials, themselves often smokers, proved reluctant to enforce them. Corruption was rampant. Smugglers bribed their way past patrols, and merchants paid to look the other way. Each new edict rang hollow against the reality of swelling demand and porous enforcement. The irony was bitter. The same empire that prided itself on order and hierarchy was being undermined by a substance it could neither eliminate nor control. Opium did not march across borders with armies or banners. It seeped in quietly, carried in chests, offloaded by smugglers, consumed in silence behind closed doors. And yet its impact was more corrosive than many invasions. Silver drained out of the country to pay for resin, weakening the treasury. Households crumbled under the weight of addiction. The strength of soldiers, farmers, and artisans, the very foundation of the empire, diminished under the haze of smoke. By the late 18th century, the Qing court could no longer ignore the scale of the problem. Reports from provinces painted a grim picture of widespread dependency. Imperial treasuries, once enriched by trade imbalances in China's favour, now saw silver bleeding outward in exchange for narcotics. The sense of crisis grew sharper with each passing year. Emperors issued edicts condemning the drug as poison, vowing to eradicate its use, but these proclamations were matched by Britain's growing determination to continue the trade. For every shipment seized, many more slipped through. For every den shuttered, another opened. The empire's laws clashed with the empire's cravings, and in that contradiction lay the seeds of disaster. The British, far from retreating, bristled at Chinese attempts to curtail the trade. To them, opium was not poison, but commerce, as legitimate as tea or textiles. The East India Company depended on it to balance accounts, Parliament relied on it to stabilise trade, and private merchants grew rich off its smuggling. The moral outrage of Chinese officials was met with imperial indifference. Profit was the higher law, and Britain was determined to enforce it. Thus, when the Qing dynasty redoubled its prohibitions at the close of the 18th century, the stage was set for confrontation. In the spring of 1839, a Chinese official named Lin Zexu stood on the shores of Canton and watched as thousands of chests of opium were destroyed. They had been seized from British merchants, stacked like coffins, split open and dumped into trenches. Workers mixed the resin with lime and salt water until it formed a foul sludge that was carried out to sea. For Lin, this was not only a moral stand, but an act of national defence. The Qing dynasty had watched its people waste away in clouds of smoke, had seen silver bleed from its treasuries, and had endured merchants smuggling narcotics in open defiance of imperial law. Enough was enough. Lin's memorials to the emperor thundered against the foreign traders poisoning China, and his solution was uncompromising. Seize the opium, destroy it, and force the British to stop. It was an act of defiance against empire, and one that would trigger war. The British response was swift and merciless. To merchants and Parliament alike, Lin's crackdown was not the righteous enforcement of law, but an attack on property and commerce. Chests of opium represented vast fortunes, and their destruction was framed as an insult to British honour. The government in London, urged on by lobbyists and shareholders of the East India Company, decided that force was the only answer. Gunboats were dispatched to the South China coast, sleek vessels of iron and oak bristling with cannon. The Qing Empire, which had for centuries regarded itself as the centre of civilization, suddenly faced the full might of industrial warfare. The battles that followed were brutally uneven. British warships shelled Chinese fortifications from distances their defenders could not match. Muskets and cannons manned by the Qing garrisons were outdated, their powder damp, and their tactics antiquated. The British Navy, meanwhile, combined firepower with speed, cutting off supply lines and blockading ports with ruthless efficiency. In skirmish after skirmish, Chinese forces were overwhelmed. Soldiers who had trained with bows and matchlocks were forced to confront disciplined volleys of musket fire and broadsides from ships that could outgun entire coastal batteries. The war was less a clash of equals than a demonstration of what industrialization had made possible for one empire and impossible for another. For the people of China, the war meant disruption and humiliation. Villages along the coast saw their homes bombarded and their livelihoods shattered. Refugees crowded inland, carrying tales of fire and thunder raining from the sea. Merchants in Canton watched their warehouses burned and their trade halted, while farmers saw their taxes raised to fund defences that repeatedly failed. To ordinary people, the war was less about opium than about survival in the face of unstoppable destruction. For officials in Beijing, however, it was a crisis of legitimacy. How could the empire that had once demanded tribute from the world now find itself beaten by a handful of foreign ships? Lin Zexu himself was caught in the contradiction. He had acted with integrity, enforcing imperial law against a poison that was hollowing out his people. Yet his crackdown had invited retaliation that the empire was unprepared to withstand. He became both a hero and a scapegoat, praised for his virtue, but blamed for provoking catastrophe. His letters, preserved to this day, reveal a man torn between moral conviction and the bitter recognition that China was militarily weak. He appealed to Britain with eloquent arguments, insisting that no civilized nation could defend the mass sale of poison, but his words were drowned out by the roar of cannon fire. By 1842, the outcome was undeniable. The Qing dynasty, unable to defend its coasts or repel British forces, sued for peace. The Treaty of Nanjing was signed aboard a British ship, a setting that symbolized the new balance of power. The terms were humiliating. China ceded Hong Kong to Britain, opened 5 ports to foreign trade, and agreed to pay a massive indemnity for the costs of the war. The opium trade itself was not legalized outright, but the British made no secret of their intention to continue. The treaty was less about regulation than about submission. China had been forced open, its sovereignty violated, its dignity shredded. The consequences went beyond territory and money. The Treaty of Nanjing marked the beginning of what Chinese historians would later call the Century of Humiliation, a period when foreign powers dictated terms to a once proud empire. The opium trade, far from being curtailed, expanded under Britain's protection. Merchants who had once feared confiscation now operated with near impunity, knowing that the threat of gunboats stood behind them. Silver continued to drain from China, addicts continued to waste away, and families continued to fracture under the weight of dependency. The war that had begun as a stand against narcotics ended as a demonstration that profit and power would always outweigh morality. For Britain, the victory was framed as a triumph of free trade, a defence of commercial rights. Politicians in Parliament congratulated themselves on protecting British merchants, while the East India Company counted its profits. The hypocrisy was glaring. The same leaders who had condemned the destruction of opium chests as barbaric now celebrated the destruction of Chinese cities as necessary. The empire's moral posture, always fragile, dissolved entirely in the smoke of the cannons. What remained was the cold arithmetic of commerce. Opium could be sold, silver could be gained, and if China resisted, it could be bombarded into submission. The First Opium War revealed the stark imbalance between industrial Britain and Imperial China. It was not simply a conflict over drugs, but a collision between two worldviews. China still imagined itself as the Middle Kingdom, self-sufficient and superior, while Britain approached the world as a marketplace to be pried open by force if necessary. In the clash between those visions, the canon decided the outcome. China's sovereignty had been punctured, and Britain had secured not only profits, but precedent. Other Western powers would soon demand the same privileges, carving their own spheres of influence out of China's weakened body. Yet the immediate result was clear enough. Opium continued to pour into the empire, its flow now shielded by the terms of an unequal treaty. The farmers of Bengal still bent over their poppy fields, the warehouses of Calcutta still overflowed with resin, and the pipes of Canton still glowed with smoke. Lin Zexu's stand had been noble, but it had failed, drowned beneath the tide of imperial ambition. The Qing dynasty, humiliated and weakened, had signed away its ability to resist. Britain, triumphant, carried on selling the very poison that had provoked the war in the first place. The defeat of the First Opium War left deep scars on China. Ports were pried open, indemnities drained the treasury, and Hong Kong sat under foreign control as a daily reminder of humiliation. Yet beneath the surface, resentment smouldered. Officials chafed under the terms of the Treaty of Nanjing. Merchants resented the encroachment of foreign traders, and the court in Beijing could not shake the shame of having been forced into submission. The British, for their part, interpreted the treaty not as a settlement, but as a beginning. They had forced the door open, now they intended to push it wider. Within less than 2 decades, the tension erupted again, this time with Britain joined by France, in what would be remembered as the Second Opium War. The spark was almost absurd in its triviality. In 1856, Chinese officials in Canton seized a ship called the Arrow, a vessel registered in Hong Kong, but crewed largely by Chinese. The arrest of its sailors and the lowering of its British flag was treated by Britain not as a local enforcement of law, but as an international insult. In reality, the incident was minor, but for a government eager to expand its privileges in China, it provided the perfect pretext. Britain demanded apologies, compensation, and new concessions. When these were not forthcoming, gunboats once again bombarded Chinese fortifications. The empire that had barely recovered from its first humiliation was dragged into a second conflict, one it was even less prepared to resist. France joined the fray soon after, citing the execution of a French missionary as its justification. In truth, Paris saw an opportunity to claim the same privileges Britain had wrested from China, and was unwilling to let its rival enjoy the spoils alone. The result was a combined Anglo-French assault, their ships blockading ports, and their soldiers marching inland. The imbalance of power was no less stark than it had been in the 1840s. Chinese forces still relying on antiquated weapons and fractured command structures could not withstand the industrialized warfare of the West. Cannon fire pounded fortifications, troops looted towns, and once again China's sovereignty dissolved under the thunder of foreign guns. The war was fought not only along the coast but deeper into the Chinese heartland. British and French forces marched toward Beijing, determined to force the Qing court into compliance. In 1860, they captured the capital's outer defences and advanced on the Forbidden City itself. When negotiations faltered, the invaders chose an act of symbolic violence that still resonates in Chinese memory: the destruction of the old summer palace, the Yuanmingyuan. Once a sprawling complex of gardens, libraries and artworks, it was looted and burned, its treasures carried off to Europe as trophies. What had been intended as a marvel of culture became rubble and ash, a deliberate humiliation inflicted on the Qing dynasty. The empire that had once seen itself as the centre of civilization now saw its symbols reduced to cinders by foreigners who demanded nothing more noble than commercial rights. The treaties that followed reflected the imbalance of power. The Treaty of Tianjin, signed in 1858 and ratified under duress in 1860, granted Britain and France new privileges. Additional ports were opened to foreign trade, missionaries were allowed free movement throughout the empire, and opium, the very commodity that had sparked so much misery, was effectively legalized. Foreign diplomats gained the right to reside in Beijing, an unprecedented intrusion into the imperial capital. The Qing court, long accustomed to dictating terms to its neighbours, was forced to accept foreign envoys as equals, or in practice, as superiors. Each clause of the treaties was another cut into the fabric of Chinese sovereignty, and each cut deepened the sense of humiliation. Foreign enclaves soon flourished. In treaty ports like Shanghai and Tianjin, Western merchants established settlements where Chinese law held little sway. Streets filled with foreign shops, churches and warehouses, guarded by foreign police and protected by foreign navies. These enclaves became hubs of commerce, channels through which not only tea and silk flowed outward, but opium flowed inward. The irony was cruel. The drug that had provoked 2 wars was now entrenched as legitimate trade, its sale protected by treaties imposed at cannon point. What had once been smuggled through the shadows was now displayed openly in warehouses, weighed on scales, and carried into homes with no fear of confiscation. The consequences for Chinese society were devastating. Addiction deepened across provinces, spreading through cities, villages, and military garrisons alike. Silver drained steadily from the economy, leaving the state weakened and families impoverished. The social fabric frayed as labourers abandoned work, households collapsed, and soldiers grew unreliable. Officials, themselves not immune to the haze of smoke, struggled to enforce laws or collect taxes. The empire's strength ebbed away, not in dramatic battles, but in the slow suffocation of its people by pipes and resin. The treaties had ensured not just temporary humiliation, but long-term corrosion, a steady weakening of China's ability to resist foreign intrusion. For Britain and France, the war was presented as another victory for free trade and civilization. Newspapers in London praised the triumph of Western arms, while salons in Paris displayed treasures looted from the Summer Palace. The hypocrisy was glaring. Civilization, it seemed, was defined not by culture or morality, but by firepower and profit. The same powers that spoke of progress and enlightenment defended their right to flood another nation with narcotics. In their view, China's suffering was irrelevant, a necessary cost of keeping markets open and empires strong. The rhetoric of commerce masked the reality of exploitation, just as surely as opium smoke masked the reality of decay. Inside China, the psychological damage was as severe as the physical. Each defeat eroded confidence in the Qing dynasty, fueling rebellions and undermining loyalty to the throne. The Taiping Rebellion, which had already convulsed parts of the empire, gained momentum in the wake of foreign invasions. Ordinary people, caught between internal uprisings and external humiliation, saw little reason to trust the government that failed to protect them. The dynasty's legitimacy crumbled, not in one sudden collapse, but in a series of defeats and humiliations that made survival seem like endurance rather than governance. By 1860, when the dust settled and the treaties were signed, China was fractured. Its sovereignty had been compromised, its capital looted, its ports carved into foreign enclaves. Opium, once banned and condemned, was now entrenched as legal commerce, its presence woven into the daily life of the empire. The wars had proven not only the military superiority of the West, but the vulnerability of China's institutions, its inability to adapt to a world reshaped by industrial power and global trade. The empire remained intact in name, but in practice it had been forced to accept subordination to foreign interests. The real legacy of the Opium Wars was not written in naval dispatches or sealed in diplomatic agreements. It was written in the interiors of dim, crowded rooms across China. The battlefield shifted inward, into houses, taverns, and makeshift dens where men and women reclined under a haze of smoke. While soldiers and diplomats congratulated themselves or mourned their losses, the common people lived out the true consequence of empire. Evenings lost to the glow of pipes, bodies surrendered to the resin of foreign poppies. If the wars had shattered China's sovereignty, the dens revealed the quieter devastation of its people. Entering one of these spaces was like stepping into another world. The first thing that struck any visitor was the air itself. Thick, pungent, cloying, opium smoke did not dissipate quickly. It clung to the walls, soaked into the mats, and hovered like a fog just above the floor. Lamps burned dimly, casting a reddish glow that blurred the edges of faces and furniture. The smell was equal parts sweet and acrid, a perfume of decay that settled into clothes and skin. For those unaccustomed, the atmosphere was suffocating. For those who came nightly, it was home. The arrangement of bodies told the story more clearly than any official report. Reclining on low couches or stretched out on straw mats, the smokers arranged themselves with a languid familiarity. Pipes rested on their lips, held delicately or clutched with trembling fingers, while assistants crouched nearby to keep the lamps alive and the resin bubbling. Conversation was sparse, punctuated by murmurs and occasional coughs. The rhythm of the room was slow, almost ritualistic. Inhale, exhale, sigh, recline. Hours passed without urgency, marked only by the shifting of bodies and the passing of pipes from hand to hand. For newcomers, the process of smoking was bewildering in its detail. The pipe was long, often with a heavy ceramic or brass bowl attached. A small pellet of opium, prepared by heating and kneading, was placed on the bowl and held over a lamp until it bubbled. The smoker drew in the vapour, not the flame, and then leaned back as the warmth spread through their body. The assistants, often younger men or women, worked with practised hands, shaping pellets, tending lamps, and keeping the ritual flowing. This constant choreography allowed the addicts to remain in their stupor, without interruption, the room sustained by the labour of those not yet fully consumed by smoke. The bodies themselves bore the marks of dependency, cheeks hollowed, eyes dulled, limbs wasted. Many smokers were skeletal, their movements slow and uncertain, except when raising a pipe to their lips. Teeth blackened, skin took on a yellow pallor, and coughs racked chests that could no longer endure exertion. Yet despite the evidence of decay, there was an eerie tranquility. The addicts did not thrash or rave. They reclined in near silence, expressions slack, as though surrendering to a peace that life outside the den could not provide. To outsiders, the sight was grotesque. To the smokers themselves, it was relief. The dens were not confined to one social class. Wealthy merchants constructed elaborate chambers with carved wood, embroidered cushions, and attendants who ensured every comfort. The poor gathered in cramped, filthy rooms, their mats torn, their pipes crude, their lamps smoking with soot. But whether rich or poor, the ritual was the same. Inhalation dulled the same pains, induced the same stupor, and exacted the same price. The flower that once bloomed in the fields of Bengal now bloomed in lungs across China, erasing distinctions of rank in its quiet conquest. Outside the dens, the consequences multiplied. Families were left destitute, as wages disappeared into smoke. Children scavenged or starved while their parents reclined in oblivion. Workplaces suffered as craftsmen lost their skill and soldiers their stamina. Villages emptied of labour as men drifted into towns in search of dens. Women too succumbed, often in secrecy, retreating into corners of homes where pipes could be hidden until discovery came too late. The empire itself seemed to stagger under the weight of a narcotic haze, its people drained of vigour by the very commodity that had been forced upon them. Officials raided dens from time to time, dragging out addicts to face punishment. But the scale of the problem made enforcement almost meaningless. For every den shut down, another opened nearby. For every pipe confiscated, another was carved. Bribes smoothed the way for smugglers and proprietors, while officials themselves often indulged in the very substance they were supposed to suppress. The hypocrisy was as thick as the smoke. Laws existed on parchment, reality existed in haze. The empire's response was as lethargic as its addicts, incapable of matching the vigour of the trade that sustained the dens. The atmosphere of these spaces seeped into the imagination of foreigners as well. Western travellers, missionaries and diplomats who ventured into the dens carried home vivid descriptions. They wrote of dim rooms filled with skeletal figures, of pipes glowing in the dark, of silence broken only by coughing. Their accounts mixed fascination with revulsion, painting the dens as symbols of both decadence and decay. To some, they were dens of exotic mystery, an oriental spectacle to be observed with a voyeur's curiosity. To others, they were cautionary tales, proof of the moral ruin caused by narcotics. Illustrations and engravings soon circulated in the West, exaggerating the imagery for dramatic effect. Newspapers published sketches of emaciated smokers sprawled in shadowy rooms, their pipes grotesquely oversized, their expressions slack with oblivion. These images fed a growing moral panic, convincing Western audiences that China had been hollowed out by smoke and weakness. The irony was suffocating. The same powers that had forced opium into China now used the spectacle of its consumption to justify further interference. The dens in Western eyes were not the product of empire's greed, but the evidence of China's decadence. Yet behind the caricatures lay a truth too stark to ignore. The dens were real, the bodies were real, and the smoke that filled those rooms was the direct consequence of global commerce. The wars and treaties had ensured supply. The dens bore witness to the demand. In these interiors, the abstract mechanics of empire became personal ruin, played out in lungs and veins, in skeletal bodies sprawled on mats. If the battlefield had once been the coastline, it was now the human frame itself, conquered not by cannon but by smoke. This image of the opium den, half reality, half myth, travelled back to the West and took root in its imagination. It became at once a fascination and a warning, a vision of exotic ruin used to condemn China, even as Western merchants continued to supply the very drug that sustained it. The dens, dim and silent, haunted not only the alleys of Canton and Shanghai, but also the pages of Western newspapers and the conversations of parlour rooms in London and Paris. They stood as proof of a contradiction too large to resolve, the empire that condemned what it had itself created. While the opium dens of China filled Western imaginations with images of smoke and ruin, Britain itself was hardly free of the poppy's grasp. The empire's homeland, the very society that congratulated itself on commerce and progress, was awash with opium in a quieter, more domestic form. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, was everywhere in Victorian Britain. It was sold in apothecaries, grocers, and even by travelling peddlers, poured into small bottles and advertised with calm confidence as a cure for almost everything. If the Chinese addicts sprawled in a smoky den, became the emblem of weakness abroad, The British addict reclined in a parlour chair, dosing from a neatly labelled bottle on the mantel. One was condemned as decadent. The other was excused as civilised. Yet the substance inside was the same. To walk into a Victorian household was to enter a landscape saturated with laudanum. Mothers kept bottles in their cupboards, next to teas and preserves, ready to be spooned into the mouths of restless infants. Children crying at night could be pacified with a few drops of Godfrey's cordial or Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, patent medicines whose ingredients included hefty doses of opium. The results were effective, sometimes fatally so. Babies fell silent, mothers slept soundly, and death certificates later recorded causes as vague as failure to thrive. In an age with little understanding of addiction and few protections for consumers, the line between remedy and poison was walked daily, often by those who believed they were acting responsibly. Adults relied on laudanum just as heavily. It was prescribed for headaches, stomach cramps, insomnia, coughs, nervous conditions, and even vague diagnoses like female troubles or melancholy. A gentleman might take it before bed to calm his thoughts. A lady might dose herself before social events to keep her composure. For the working poor, it was sometimes the only medicine they could afford, purchased in small amounts from corner shops. Labourers used it to ease the pain of endless shifts. Seamstresses swallowed it to dull hunger. Miners relied on it to soothe aching limbs. The drug's ubiquity blurred class lines, but its respectability was always maintained by the fact that it came in a bottle, sold openly, recommended by doctors and shopkeepers alike. The poets and intellectuals of the age gave laudanum a literary sheen, romanticising their own dependency, even as it hollowed them out. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, whose verses reshaped English literature, was also enslaved to the bottle. He praised opium's ability to unlock visions, but lamented its toll on his mind and body. Thomas de Quincey, in his Confessions of an English Opium Eater, 1821, offered a vivid, often grotesque account of his habit, describing nights of sublime visions followed by mornings of horror and despair. His book fascinated the public, turning addiction into spectacle, yet it did little to curb the enthusiasm for laudanum. If anything, it confirmed the sense that opium was both dangerous and irresistible, capable of producing genius and ruin in the same breath. Readers might have been warned, but they were also titillated, eager to try what had inspired such haunting prose. Doctors themselves were not immune. Many Victorian physicians kept laudanum at hand for their own ailments, dosing themselves as casually as they prescribed it to patients. The medical journals of the time debated proper dosages and warned of excessive use, but the warnings rarely translated into restraint. Addiction was not understood as a medical condition, but as a moral weakness, a personal failing. Patients who demanded ever more laudanum were dismissed as weak-willed rather than recognised as chemically dependent. The irony was bitter. The very men entrusted with safeguarding health were often themselves entangled in the poppy's grip. The culture of respectability concealed much of the damage. Unlike the dens of China, Victorian Britain's addiction was private, hidden behind curtains and cupboards. A mother, dosing her child, did not imagine herself complicit in vice. A gentleman pouring a spoonful before bed did not imagine himself an addict. Even when bodies weakened, appetites failed, and tempers grew erratic, the connection to laudanum was rarely acknowledged. The drug's integration into daily life made it invisible. It was medicine after all, advertised, prescribed, sold without stigma. Dependency was reframed as constitution, collapse as frailty, death as natural misfortune. Yet the evidence mounted. Coroners recorded unexplained infant deaths, in towns where soothing syrups were common. Clergymen reported congregants numbed and detached, unable to focus on sermons. Families noticed that their laudanum bottles emptied faster than seemed possible, and still the cycle continued. Apothecaries rang up sales, mothers soothed children, and poets wrote visions. The empire might have condemned China for succumbing to smoke, but Britain's own addiction was more widespread, hidden in plain sight in nearly every home. The grotesque irony deepened when Britain used the image of Chinese opium dens as moral justification for further imperial intrusion. Newspapers published lurid sketches of skeletal addicts sprawled on mats, describing the vice that had hollowed out a once proud civilization. Yet the same papers carried advertisements for soothing syrups and cough remedies laced with opium, marketed to British families without a hint of contradiction. The double standard was staggering. Chinese addiction was decadence. British addiction was medicine. The empire's hypocrisy was as thick as the smoke in a Canton den, and just as suffocating. Some reformers did begin to raise alarms. Clergy, social critics, and a handful of physicians pointed to the dangers of widespread laudanum use, especially among the poor. They warned of dependency, of infants poisoned by careless dosing, of families unravelling under the haze of addiction. Pamphlets circulated, parliamentary debates touched briefly on the subject, and a few regulations were proposed. But serious restrictions never materialised. The drug's grip was too deep, its sales too profitable, and its presence too normalised. Like so many Victorian contradictions, the problem was acknowledged only in whispers, never in policy. By the latter half of the 19th century, laudanum was as common in Britain as bread or beer. Bottles could be found in aristocratic parlours and workers' cottages alike, their labels promising relief from every imaginable discomfort. Dependency grew quietly, woven into daily life, unacknowledged and unstoppable. The empire that prided itself on discipline and progress was, in truth, dependent on the same poppy resin it condemned abroad. Families lived and died under its influence, their stories lost to silence, their bottles long since emptied and forgotten. And while Britain was dosing itself into quiet oblivion, another society, across the Atlantic, was finding its own ways to embrace the poppy. In America, apothecaries stocked their shelves with opium tinctures. Doctors prescribed morphine with abandon, and the bloody years of the Civil War would bring a new chapter in the story of addiction. The sleep bringer had crossed oceans again, settling into yet another culture that believed it could control what no civilization ever had. In 19th century America, you did not need to walk far to find opium. Every town had its apothecary, and every apothecary stocked bottles of tinctures laced with the resin of the poppy. Laudanum, morphine, and opium pills lined the shelves beside jars of herbs, cough syrups, and patent medicines. Advertisements in newspapers promised miraculous cures. Pain stilled, nerves calmed, coughs banished. Mothers could buy syrups for their children, farmers could purchase tonics for their aches, and weary clerks could dose themselves before bed. There was no stigma, no sense that the drug belonged to the margins of society. In America, as in Britain, opium was medicine, its dangers concealed behind the ordinary ritual of a spoonful before sleep. The bottles were everywhere. In New England villages, in southern plantations, in the rough mining towns of the frontier, laudanum was as much a staple as flour or tobacco. Patent medicines like Perry Davis's painkiller or Ayer's cherry pectoral claimed to soothe everything from indigestion to nervous collapse. Their secret ingredient always the same, opium in one form or another. Women, often trapped in cycles of childbirth and household labour, relied on it for relief from pain and exhaustion. Doctors prescribed it liberally, dosing patients with morphine injections for anything from fevers to menstrual cramps. Pharmacies sold it by the ounce, mail-order catalogues shipped it across states, and itinerant salesmen hawked it from wagons. The poppy had crossed the Atlantic and settled comfortably into the rhythms of American life. But the true scale of America's entanglement with opium was revealed during the Civil War. The conflict was brutal beyond imagining, fought with rifled muskets, bayonets, and artillery that shredded bodies by the thousands. In field hospitals, surgeons worked without antiseptics or germ theory, armed only with saws, bandages, and the poppy's resin distilled into morphine. The hypodermic syringe, a relatively new invention, allowed physicians to inject the drug directly into wounded soldiers. Morphine dulled agony with an efficiency unmatched by any other treatment. Amputations, extractions, and crude operations became survivable, not because they were less traumatic, but because morphine allowed the patient to endure them. The drug became as essential as bandages or bullets, a constant companion to the war. The aftermath was quieter, but no less destructive. Thousands of veterans returned home with wounds that never healed, nerves that never calmed, and an unshakable reliance on morphine. They had learned to depend on injections to sleep, to eat, to still the tremors of pain and memory. What began as treatment became compulsion, and what had once been a battlefield necessity followed them into peacetime. The phenomenon was given a grim nickname: soldier's disease. It was not recognized as addiction in the modern sense, but it was widely observed. Men who had marched under banners returned to farms, shops, and families unable to live without the drug. Their lives, already scarred by war, were hollowed further by dependency. The pattern extended beyond veterans. Families of soldiers often shared in their habits, wives and mothers learning to prepare doses, children witnessing syringes and spoons as ordinary household objects. Pharmacies continued to sell morphine freely, its dangers dismissed or underestimated. Doctors praised it as a medical marvel, a gift of science that allowed them to treat suffering more effectively than ever before. Critics existed, warning of dependency and collapse, but their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming demand for relief. A nation traumatized by war was in no mood to surrender its most effective comfort. Dependency crept into every class and region. In small towns, farmers relied on laudanum to dull back-breaking labour and the anxiety of uncertain harvests. In cities, businessmen carried bottles in their pockets to manage the strains of commerce. Women, encouraged by physicians to treat nervous disorders with morphine, often found themselves unable to function without it. The boundary between medical treatment and addiction blurred until it all but disappeared. A patient was never described as addicted, but as delicate, ill, or constitutionally weak. The stigma fell not on the drug, but on the sufferer, whose collapse was seen as personal rather than chemical. The grotesque irony was that even as America prided itself on independence and vigour, it was quietly dosing itself into dependence. Advertisements continued to proclaim miraculous cures, poets wrote of dreamlike states, and reformers occasionally sounded alarms, but the bottles kept selling. For many Americans, opium was less a vice than a necessity, the only reliable way to manage lives filled with labour, illness, and grief. Entire communities lived under its haze, though rarely admitting it aloud. Unlike alcohol, which carried moral condemnation, opium was invisible, its bottles hidden in cupboards, its effects mistaken for ordinary frailty. The Civil War veterans provided the most visible example, but they were not alone. Dependency spread through the rural South, the industrial North, and the expanding West. It touched women in parlours and men in fields, the wealthy in their studies and the poor in their cabins, opium was not confined to dens or marginalized groups. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. Yet the image of the addict remained distorted. Americans preferred to see themselves as users of medicine, not victims of vice. The Chinese smoker sprawled in a den was condemned as decadent, but the Americans sipping laudanum or injecting morphine was excused as a patient. The hypocrisy echoed that of Britain, dressed in the same respectable clothes. By the late 19th century, the scale of America's addiction was undeniable, though still poorly understood. Newspapers occasionally reported on the opium habit, with a mixture of fascination and alarm. Temperance activists lumped it alongside alcohol as a moral danger. Physicians began to notice patterns, though they lacked the language or frameworks to describe them as addiction. The term soldier's disease lingered as shorthand, but it was only one face of a broader problem that touched civilians as much as veterans. The poppy's grip was not a matter of isolated cases, but of an entire society leaning heavily on resin and tincture. Meanwhile, the global trade that supplied America's pharmacies and apothecaries continued to grow. The fields of Bengal still bloomed under company contracts. Their resin still packed into chests and shipped across oceans. Smugglers carried it into markets where it was banned. Merchants sold it openly where it was legal, and governments collected taxes regardless of the human cost. The opium that filled American bottles was part of the same vast machinery that sustained British tea tables and Chinese smoking rooms. It was never only a domestic matter, but always a link in a global chain of commerce, exploitation, and profit. For every soldier in America nursing his morphine habit, there was a farmer in India trapped in debt, a merchant in London counting dividends, and a smuggler in Canton bribing officials. Opium's reach was no longer confined to specific nations or even continents. What had once been a local remedy in temples and apothecaries had become a global commodity, transported in bulk across oceans, traded in warehouses, and consumed in countless forms by millions of people. To look at the trade in this period is to step back from the parlour or the den and see the broader machinery at work. A network of cultivation, smuggling, taxation, and dependency that stretched from the fields of India to the ports of China, from American pharmacies to European drawing rooms. The story was no longer about individuals or even empires alone. It was about a world economy stitched together with resin scraped from the heads of poppies. The East India Company remained at the centre of the system, though it was no longer alone. Its monopoly on Indian opium ensured that Bengal and Bihar remained vast poppy fields. Farmers coerced into producing resin at prices set by their colonial masters. Each year, the company organised auctions in Calcutta where hundreds of tons of opium were sold to private merchants. These merchants, many of them British or Indian intermediaries, then carried the drug onward to Canton and beyond. Officially, the company claimed its responsibility ended at the auction hall. In practice, everyone knew that the system existed to funnel narcotics into China on a colossal scale. The fiction of legality allowed London to maintain its posture, while Chinese society bore the consequences. Smuggling was not a side business, but the heart of the operation. Because Chinese law prohibited opium imports, merchants and smugglers developed elaborate methods to move the drug inland. Fast ships, known as clippers, were designed to outrun patrols and carry maximum cargo. Bribes flowed as freely as smoke, with local officials paid handsomely to look the other way. Secret warehouses were established along the coast, while river smugglers distributed smaller shipments into the countryside. The scale of the operation dwarfed any attempt at prohibition. Even when imperial authorities seized chests, the loss was considered a cost of doing business. The sheer profitability ensured that the flow never stopped, only shifted routes. Each crackdown was met with new ingenuity, each ban undermined by the inexhaustible demand that foreign traders had so carefully cultivated. The profits were staggering. In India, taxes on opium became one of the most important revenue streams for the colonial government, funding railways, bureaucracies, and armies. In Britain, dividends from the trade enriched shareholders and stabilized the empire's finances. In China, corrupt officials pocketed bribes, merchants grew rich selling contraband, and an entire shadow economy flourished around the drug. Across the Pacific, American traders also joined in, carrying opium from Turkey and the Levant to China, widening the network beyond the British system. The flower's sap had become an international currency, its value recognized in every port, its presence as familiar as tea, coffee, or sugar. But the wealth extracted from the poppy was purchased at terrible cost. In China, addiction hollowed out villages, weakened armies, and destabilized the Qing dynasty. In India, farmers lived on the edge of famine, their fields dedicated to narcotics rather than food. In Europe and America, dependency spread quietly behind closed doors, laudanum and morphine bottles, accumulating in homes and hospitals. The global trade ensured that no region was untouched. What looked like prosperity on balance sheets translated into sickness, poverty, and despair in countless households. The poppy's petals were fragile, but its roots ran deep, entangling economies and societies alike. Colonial powers justified the trade with weary cynicism. British officials spoke of free commerce, insisting that no government had the right to restrict what individuals wished to consume. The same rhetoric that defended slavery and conquest was recycled for narcotics, a convenient shield for exploitation. France, the Netherlands, and later other European empires established their own opium monopolies in Southeast Asia, taxing consumption directly and reaping revenue from the very habits they claimed to regret. In Dutch-controlled Java, government-run opium farms distributed the drug under official license, transforming addiction into an arm of state finance. The hypocrisy was astonishing but consistent. Profit always outweighed morality, and morality was always invoked only when convenient. Smugglers themselves became figures of both admiration and fear. In treaty ports like Shanghai and Hong Kong, opium traders operated with semi-legal impunity, their fortunes made on the misery of others. Some became household names, their wealth funding mansions, clubs, and social prestige. Others remained in the shadows, their ships darting along coastlines, their cargoes hidden in secret compartments. The romance of smuggling obscured its brutality. Each chest moved meant more farmers trapped in debt, more soldiers incapacitated, more families consumed by smoke. Yet the allure of profit silenced most objections. In an era when empire was measured in trade, opium was the perfect tool, universally desired, easily concealed, and ruinously addictive. The human toll was evident in statistics as much as in stories. By the mid-19th century, millions of Chinese were addicted to opium, their dependency shaping labour markets, family structures, and even military readiness. Reports from villages spoke of entire generations unable to work effectively, their vigour spent in smoke. Missionaries wrote back to Europe with horrified descriptions of dens crowded with skeletal bodies, their words often dismissed at home as exaggeration even when they understated the truth. In India, famine mortality rose as food production gave way to poppy cultivation, though colonial officials insisted on calling it unfortunate coincidence rather than policy. In America and Europe, opium habits were quietly documented but rarely publicized, hidden under the respectable label of medicine. Everywhere, the flower promised relief and delivered erosion. The global scale of the trade produced grotesque ironies. Western nations condemned opium smoking in China as evidence of Oriental decadence, while simultaneously taxing its sale in their colonies and dosing themselves with laudanum at home. Governments decried smuggling while profiting from the taxes it generated. Physicians warned of the dangers while prescribing the drug liberally. The contradictions were not accidents, but features of the system, enabling a world where everyone could denounce addiction while depending on its profits. The cycle of hypocrisy was as predictable as the cycle of dependency itself. By the late 19th century, the cracks in the global opium system were impossible to ignore. Governments that had once profited openly from the trade now faced mounting criticism from missionaries, physicians and reformers. Reports of mass addiction in China, the widespread presence of laudanum in Britain, morphine dependency in America, and the visible decline of communities in colonial territories all combined into a picture that even the most complacent could not entirely dismiss. The profits were still staggering, but the reputation of the trade had begun to sour. What had long been presented as legitimate commerce increasingly looked like moral rot, and even empire could not forever disguise poison as medicine. The first steps toward regulation were tentative, often more symbolic than substantive. In Britain, debates in Parliament reflected unease about the hypocrisy of profiting from opium abroad while condemning its effects at home. Missionaries returning from China testified to the devastation they had witnessed, their accounts filled with descriptions of hollowed bodies and wasted lives. Some members of Parliament, moved by these reports, pressed for an end to the East India Company's monopoly on cultivation in India. Yet opposition was fierce. Too much revenue depended on those fields, too much silver flowed from those chests. Calls for reform were met with the familiar defence of free trade, and reformers were accused of naivety or treachery. Still, the fact that debate occurred at all signalled that the question could no longer be ignored. In America, awareness of the problem took shape differently. The spectacle of the Chinese opium den became a fixture in newspapers and political speeches, used as a warning about vice and decadence. At the same time, morphine addiction among veterans and civilians was recognised as a domestic crisis. The contradiction was stark. While American society condemned immigrants for their supposed weakness, it ignored or excused the bottles and syringes in its own homes. By the end of the 19th century, however, the medical establishment began to push for tighter restrictions. Physicians warned of patients who could no longer live without morphine, of mothers who poisoned infants with soothing syrups, of entire communities shaped by dependency. Local laws were passed, and states began to experiment with controls on the sale of opium-based medicines. The tide was shifting slowly but unmistakably. International pressure also grew. Reformers in Britain and America joined forces with anti-opium leagues, publishing pamphlets and holding rallies that denounced the trade as a crime against humanity. Missionaries in China lobbied governments back home, insisting that the West had a moral duty to end the export of poison. Their rhetoric was often paternalistic, but their outrage was real. By the early 20th century, these voices had gained enough traction to force governments to act. The push for regulation was no longer confined to individual nations. It became a matter of international diplomacy, a recognition that the problem was too vast for piecemeal solutions. The turning point came with the Hague Opium Convention of 1912, the first international treaty aimed at controlling narcotics. Delegates from major powers, including Britain, the United States, and several European empires, gathered to discuss how to restrict the cultivation, trade, and consumption of opium. The language of the convention was cautious, filled with compromises and loopholes, but its existence marked a profound shift. For the first time, states acknowledged that narcotics were not simply commodities, but dangers requiring coordinated control. The Hague Convention laid the groundwork for future restrictions, signalling that the age of unregulated trade was ending. Enforcement, however, lagged far behind the rhetoric. Colonial governments that depended on opium revenue were reluctant to dismantle their monopolies. In Dutch-controlled Java, in French Indochina, in British Malaya, state-run opium shops remained central to budgets. Taxes collected from addicts paid for railways, schools, and bureaucracies, and administrators were unwilling to sacrifice such dependable income. Restrictions therefore advanced unevenly. Some states imposed bans on domestic consumption while continuing to export abroad. Others tightened medical regulations but turned a blind eye to smuggling. The hypocrisy of the previous century persisted, though now clothed in the language of reform. Despite these contradictions, the legal landscape began to change. In Britain, the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 placed opium, morphine, and related substances under stricter control, limiting their availability to medical prescriptions. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 imposed taxes and registration requirements, effectively criminalizing non-medical use. Across Europe, similar measures were introduced, restricting the once free flow of tinctures and syrups. Pharmacies that had once sold opium openly now required licenses, and physicians became gatekeepers rather than suppliers. The cultural image of the drug shifted as well. What had been respectable medicine was recast as dangerous vice, a transformation that marked the beginning of modern drug control. The transition was not smooth. Patients who had long depended on laudanum or morphine found themselves stigmatized as addicts, their needs dismissed as criminal rather than medical. Black markets emerged, fueled by smugglers who adapted as quickly as ever to new restrictions. Organized crime discovered the profits that could be made from supplying narcotics outside legal channels, laying the foundations for syndicates that would dominate the 20th century. The attempt to criminalize opium succeeded in shrinking its legal presence, but also ensured that its shadow economy flourished. The poppy had lost its respectability, but not its appeal. China, meanwhile, continued to suffer under the legacy of the 19th century. Efforts to eradicate opium smoking were met with mixed results. Campaigns to destroy pipes and burn stockpiles achieved temporary successes, but demand remained entrenched. Even as Western governments restricted their own populations, Chinese society bore the scars of decades of imposed addiction. The irony was bitter. The very powers that had once forced opium on China now congratulated themselves for leading the charge to regulate it. History's ledger remained unbalanced, its profits pocketed, its costs externalized. The medical profession played a central role in reshaping the narrative. As germ theory and modern pharmacology advanced, the reliance on crude tinctures gave way to more precise treatments. Doctors increasingly viewed opium not as a cure-all, but as a dangerous last resort. Journals published studies on dependency, withdrawal, and the destructive effects of long-term use. The idea of addiction as a medical condition, rather than a moral failing, began to take hold, though slowly and unevenly. This shift helped to justify restrictions, framing them not only as moral imperatives, but as scientific necessities. The authority of medicine, once complicit in the spread of opium, now lent credibility to its criminalization. In the closing years of the 19th century, as governments congratulated themselves on regulating opium and morphine, a German pharmaceutical company unveiled what it claimed was the perfect solution. In 1898, Bayer, already known for its aspirin, introduced a new drug to the market with great fanfare. It was synthesized from morphine, but according to the company's chemists, it carried none of morphine's dangerous baggage. The substance was dubbed heroin, a name derived from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, because test subjects reportedly felt strong, vigorous, and invulnerable after taking it. The message was simple: heroin was modern, scientific, and, most importantly, safe. The pitch was irresistible. Where opium had become tainted by centuries of abuse and morphine by its association with battlefield dependency, heroin was marketed as a clean break from the past. Bayer presented it as non-addictive, an ideal replacement for both cough suppressants and painkillers. Pamphlets and advertisements promoted it not as a narcotic, but as a medical marvel, a triumph of chemistry over centuries of crude tinctures. Doctors were told they could prescribe it freely, without fear of creating dependency. Parents were assured it could be given to children for coughs and colds. In an era hungry for modern solutions, heroin fit perfectly into the story of progress. Pharmacies across Europe and America quickly embraced the new drug. Bottles labelled heroin appeared on counters beside aspirin, sold as syrups, lozenges, and tablets. Doctors prescribed it for everything from asthma to bronchitis, from chronic pain to insomnia. It was particularly praised as a cough remedy. Children's cough syrups, laced with heroin, were sold openly, their packaging adorned with reassuring labels and cheerful imagery. A mother who would never have dreamt of giving her child laudanum could now spoon out a syrup marketed as safer and more advanced. The irony was suffocating. The improvement on opium was in fact far worse. The truth emerged quickly, though few wanted to admit it at first. Patients given heroin developed tolerance at alarming speed, requiring larger and larger doses to achieve the same effects. Dependency set in with a ferocity even stronger than that of morphine. Those who had switched to heroin in the hope of escaping morphine habits found themselves even more ensnared. Withdrawal was brutal, cravings overwhelming. By the early 20th century, reports of heroin fiends began to surface, shocking a medical community that had embraced the drug as a safe alternative. What was supposed to be a solution revealed itself as an acceleration of the same problem. The grotesque detail of heroin addiction spread through hospitals and cities alike. Patients grew restless, unable to function without their doses, begging doctors for refills under the guise of persistent coughs or chronic ailments. Some doctors, themselves unaware of how quickly dependency could form, complied, unintentionally fueling habits they could no longer control. Others cut patients off, leaving them to seek the drug from less scrupulous sources. Addiction appeared not only among the poor, but also among the middle and upper classes, those who had trusted modern medicine to protect them. The respectability of heroin collapsed almost as soon as it had been established, leaving behind another cycle of broken promises and broken bodies. The spread of heroin overlapped with growing fears about urban vice. In cities like New York, London, and Berlin, journalists began to write exposés about addicts wandering the streets, collapsing in alleys, or congregating in boarding houses, where heroin was shared in secret. Illustrations in newspapers depicted thin, hollow-eyed figures clutching syringes, echoing the imagery once reserved for Chinese opium smokers. The moral panic grew, fueled by the same mixture of fascination and fear that had followed opium dens. This time, however, the threat was closer to home, infecting not some distant empire, but the very heart of Western cities. Governments scrambled to respond. The Hague Convention of 1912, which had already begun to restrict opium, expanded its scope to include heroin and morphine. National laws followed quickly. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 brought heroin under strict regulation, effectively criminalizing its non-medical use. Britain and other European nations imposed similar restrictions, limiting the drug to hospital prescriptions and cutting off its availability in ordinary pharmacies. The very substance that had been marketed as harmless now carried the stigma of vice, associated less with medicine than with crime. For many patients, these restrictions arrived too late. Those who had been encouraged to take heroin for coughs or pain found themselves abandoned, their dependency suddenly criminalized. Some sought treatment, though options were limited and often cruel. Others turned to illicit sources, buying from smugglers who quickly filled the gap left by pharmacies. The cycle of regulation and black markets, already familiar in the history of alcohol and gambling, now attached itself firmly to narcotics. Heroin, denied the legitimacy of medicine, slipped into the shadows, its trade carried on by those willing to profit from prohibition. The criminalization of heroin marked a turning point in the global drug story. For the first time, a major narcotic was not only regulated, but pushed decisively into illegality. The image of the addict shifted with it. No longer the patient in a doctor's office or the child dosed by a parent. The addict became a criminal figure, pursued by police, punished by courts, and stigmatized by society. The transition was as much cultural as legal. The respectable bottle on the apothecary's shelf had become contraband, and those who relied on it were recast as outcasts. Yet the drug did not disappear. The same global trade networks that had carried opium from India to China adapted easily to the new demand. Smugglers trafficked heroin across borders, crime syndicates discovered its profitability, and addicts continued to find it in the shadows. The crackdown did not end the story, it simply changed its stage. What had once been medicine was now contraband. What had once been a product of pharmacies was now a product of gangs. The flower's resin had taken on a new form, and with it a new chapter of dependency and ruin. By the early 20th century, the story of opium had shifted decisively from medicine to crime. What had once been sold in apothecaries and prescribed by doctors was now condemned by lawmakers, patrolled by police, and whispered about in alleyways. Prohibition became the dominant policy and punishment its chosen tool. Governments congratulated themselves on regulating narcotics, declaring victory in parliaments and congresses, even as addiction continued quietly in tenements, hospitals, and prisons. The war on opium was less a medical campaign than a legal one, built not on healing but on control. The first line of attack was legislation, laws such as the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in the United States, the Dangerous Drugs Acts in Britain, and similar measures across Europe reclassified opium, morphine, and heroin as controlled substances. Their use outside medical settings became criminal, their possession subject to fines and imprisonment. What had been a bottle on a shelf was now evidence in a courtroom. Addicts who had once been treated as patients were suddenly recast as offenders, their habits subject not to compassion but to prosecution. The shift was profound, reshaping the very image of narcotics in the public imagination. Enforcement followed swiftly. Police raids targeted opium dens that had once operated semi-openly in cities like London, New York, and San Francisco. Smugglers were hunted across ports and borders, their cargoes seized and destroyed. International cooperation expanded through treaties and conventions, with governments pledging to curb production, monitor imports, and prosecute offenders. The language of diplomacy framed these efforts as moral obligations, signs of global progress. Yet on the ground, the war was patchy, inconsistent, and often corrupt. Some officials took bribes to ignore smuggling, others indulged privately in the very drugs they condemned. The machinery of prohibition was noisy, but rarely smooth. As the state cracked down, the underworld adapted. Organised crime syndicates discovered that narcotics offered profits as rich as gambling, extortion, or prostitution, and with demand guaranteed by dependency, the trade was irresistible. Smugglers shifted routes, traffickers cultivated networks, and gangs fought for control of lucrative markets. The very act of prohibition, meant to eradicate the drug, transformed it into a black market treasure, guarded by violence and secrecy. The opium that once travelled openly in company chests now moved in hidden compartments, carried by couriers, and distributed in dim back rooms where money and misery changed hands in equal measure. The addict, once a customer at an apothecary, was pushed to the margins of society. No longer respectable, no longer hidden in plain sight, addicts became figures of stigma and shame. They were portrayed in newspapers as degraded, dangerous, even contagious. Police rounded them up, courts sentenced them, and prisons absorbed them. Medical support was rare, rehabilitation almost non-existent. Addiction was framed as criminal behaviour rather than a condition, and those caught in its grip found themselves not treated but punished. The stigma ensured silence. Families concealed addicted relatives, addicts hid their habits, and the cycle continued in shadows, growing worse for being ignored. In many cities, the racialized image of the addict deepened the divide. Chinese immigrants in America were targeted through sensationalized tales of opium dens luring white women into ruin. In Britain, the spectre of foreign vice was used to justify harsher laws. These depictions served not only to stigmatize users, but also to absolve governments of their own histories. The same empires that had once profited from forcing opium into China now portrayed the drug as an alien scourge, imported by outsiders rather than cultivated by their own greed. The hypocrisy was complete, but it proved politically useful, transforming public fear into support for crackdowns. The war on opium did succeed in reshaping the geography of the drug. Open dens became rare, replaced by hidden rooms and clandestine gatherings. Street corners and back alleys became the new points of sale. Smuggling routes stretched across oceans and deserts, a global lattice of contraband. The drug itself transformed, shifting from raw resin to refined derivatives like morphine and heroin, easier to conceal and quicker to consume. The more governments tightened their grip, the more the trade adapted, mutating into forms harder to detect and harder to control. Prohibition did not kill demand, it only altered its pathways. In prisons, the consequences were stark. Addicts arrested for possession or petty theft to fund their habits. Filled cells, their dependency untreated, their suffering dismissed. Behind bars, withdrawal played out in agony, supervised not by doctors, but by guards. Release often meant immediate return to the cycle, with no resources for recovery. The state celebrated arrests and seizures as victories, but the human reality remained unchanged. The war was measured in numbers of raids and kilos confiscated, not in lives healed or saved. Statistics became a substitute for compassion, and the problem was declared solved on paper, even as it worsened in practice. Internationally, the effort grew more ambitious. Conferences convened, treaties signed, and commissions established to track global flows of narcotics. Colonial governments were pressured to restrict cultivation, though many still quietly profited from it. Smugglers were condemned in official speeches even as their shipments slipped past customs officers at underfunded ports. The contradictions persisted, but the rhetoric of prohibition hardened. By mid-century, the language of war was entrenched. Narcotics were enemies, addicts were casualties, and the state was the embattled defender of public health and morality. The irony was that while Prohibition sought to erase narcotics from respectable life, it inadvertently gave them a new cultural power. In literature and film, the opium den became a setting of danger and allure, a symbol of both exotic decadence and urban decay. Addicts, once portrayed as patients, became archetypes of ruin, used to frighten or titillate audiences. Musicians, writers, and artists occasionally embraced the drug as a source of inspiration, further complicating its image. The war on opium may have tightened laws, but it also ensured that narcotics lingered in the cultural imagination, symbols of both Prohibition's severity and its failure. By the middle decades of the 20th century, Prohibition had become the unquestioned policy. Laws stiffened, sentences lengthened, and police powers expanded. Yet addiction did not vanish. Instead, it grew more hidden, more stigmatized, and more entangled with crime. The black market flourished, syndicates thrived, and governments congratulated themselves on victories that were more symbolic than real. The war on opium had reshaped the drug's image, transforming it from a common medicine to a forbidden vice, from a respectable bottle to a criminal syringe. Culture itself began to absorb this new imagery, preparing the stage for the next chapter, when narcotics would re-emerge not only as contraband, but as symbols within music, art, and counterculture. The war on opium had been waged for decades, yet the drug never truly disappeared. It survived in hidden corners and subcultures, moving quietly through cities even as governments proclaimed victory. Where earlier generations had swallowed laudanum or smoked pipes in dim dens, new ones injected heroin with hypodermic needles or passed it hand to hand in alleyways. The drug's image had changed, but its presence endured. And in the mid-century shadows of jazz clubs, urban ghettos, and experimental communes, opium's most potent descendant, heroin, or smack as it was called on the street, resurfaced with new intensity. Jazz, with its nocturnal rhythms and improvisational energy, became closely associated with heroin use in the 1940s and 1950s. Musicians who spent long nights performing in smoky clubs often turned to narcotics for both relief and inspiration. Heroin promised escape from exhaustion, a haze that smoothed the edges of relentless touring and demanding audiences. Legends of the era, Charlie Parker, Billie Holiday, and many others, struggled openly with the drug, their brilliance intertwined with their dependency. The sight of a trumpeter nodding off between sets or a singer straining through withdrawal was as much a part of the scene as the music itself. Listeners romanticized the connection, imagining that the soaring notes and aching lyrics were born directly from narcotic visions. The reality was grimmer: shortened lives, ruined health, and a cycle of arrests and relapses. For law enforcement, the jazz scene became a convenient symbol of vice, particularly when coupled with racial prejudice. Newspapers ran lurid stories of black musicians ensnared by heroin, corrupting not only themselves, but also impressionable white audiences. Addiction was framed as a moral contagion, jazz as its carrier. In truth, heroin use spanned racial and social boundaries, but the stigma was deployed selectively, reinforcing stereotypes while leaving broader patterns unacknowledged. Behind the sensational headlines, the drug continued to flow, carried by smugglers and dealers who recognized that musicians were far from their only customers. By the 1960s, heroin had seeped into the wider counterculture, though it was never as central as cannabis, LSD, or other hallucinogens. The hippie movement celebrated expansion of consciousness, and heroin was often seen as the antithesis of that ideal, numbing rather than enlightening. Yet the drug was present, lingering at the edges of communes and festivals, tempting those who sought not visions, but oblivion. Some turned to it after other substances lost their thrill, chasing a different kind of escape. Others stumbled into it by accident, introduced through friends or lovers. In these settings, heroin carried a peculiar contradiction. Despised by many as a dead end, embraced by some as the ultimate detachment from a world they had already rejected. The Vietnam War intensified the problem. American soldiers stationed in Southeast Asia found heroin cheap and plentiful, sold in powder form that could be snorted or injected. For young men enduring the brutality of jungle warfare, narcotics offered relief from fear, boredom, and trauma. By the early 1970s, reports suggested that a significant portion of US troops had used heroin during their tours. Some carried the habit home, joining a wave of dependency that swept through American cities, already reeling from poverty and unrest. The war abroad had become, in part, a war at home, its veterans battling memories of combat alongside the grip of addiction. The 1970s witnessed a heroin wave that touched urban centres across the West. In New York, the drug became synonymous with crumbling neighbourhoods and rising crime. Tenements filled with addicts, needles littered sidewalks, and overdoses became grimly routine. In London, Paris, and other European capitals, similar patterns emerged. Heroin was no longer confined to subcultures or soldiers. It was a mainstream crisis visible on city streets. The image of the addict shifted again, from the jazz musician to the gaunt figure slumped in a doorway, syringe dangling from an arm. Governments responded with harsher crackdowns, expanding police powers and lengthening sentences, but the cycle of supply and demand proved unstoppable. Smugglers adjusted routes, dealers multiplied, and the haze of dependency thickened. Culturally, heroin acquired an aura of both danger and allure. In music, literature, and film, the drug became shorthand for rebellion, despair, and fatal glamour. Punk musicians in the late 1970s and early 1980s referenced heroin in their songs and lifestyles, some collapsing under its weight, others cultivating its image as part of their defiance. Writers and filmmakers depicted addicts as tragic figures, their lives consumed by a drug that offered ecstasy, followed by ruin. To audiences, heroin became both a warning and a temptation, its notoriety ensuring that it remained lodged in the cultural imagination even as authorities worked to suppress it. The human toll was relentless. Overdose deaths climbed steadily. Hospitals struggled to treat infections caused by dirty needles, and families watched loved ones disappear into dependency. The social costs mounted as crime rose in neighbourhoods where addicts stole to fund their habits, and prisons filled with users whose only offence was possession. Efforts at rehabilitation were uneven, often underfunded, and rarely prioritised. The war on drugs intensified, but like earlier wars on opium, it often punished the victims more harshly than the traffickers. The addict, once a patient, was now firmly recast as a criminal. By the closing decades of the 20th century, heroin was no longer the sole face of the poppy's legacy. Chemistry had moved beyond the fields of Bengal and the syringes of urban alleys, producing new synthetic descendants of opium that promised relief with greater precision. What began as heroin's replacement in hospitals soon spilled out of the medical system, ushering in a crisis that would dwarf all previous waves of addiction. The opioid epidemic was not born in a den or on a battlefield, but in pharmacies, clinics, and prescription pads. Where heroin had carried the stigma of crime and street life, prescription pills carried the illusion of safety. They came in amber bottles dispensed by pharmacists, prescribed by doctors. But inside the capsules and tablets was the same promise of peace, the same risk of ruin. The first phase of this new chapter was written in the language of pain management. By the 1990s, pharmaceutical companies in the United States and Europe began to argue that modern medicine had been too cautious, too hesitant to address chronic pain. They presented new opioids, oxycodone, hydrocodone, and later fentanyl patches, as breakthroughs that allowed patients to live without suffering. Advertisements assured physicians that these drugs were safe, effective, and crucially, non-addictive when used as prescribed. Conferences were held, studies selectively cited, and a wave of aggressive marketing washed through the medical profession. The message was clear: doctors who withheld opioids were failing their patients. Relief was available, and it should be prescribed liberally. Doctors, many of them overworked and under pressure to manage patients quickly, embraced the new painkillers. Prescriptions soared, filling cabinets and nightstands across households in every class and region. Pills were given for post-surgical pain, for chronic back problems, for workplace injuries, even for the vague diagnosis of pain syndrome. Unlike heroin, which had long been stigmatized, these drugs carried an air of respectability. They were dispensed in clean clinics, not shadowed alleys, their labels printed with professional precision. Patients who might never have imagined themselves addicts swallowed the pills daily, trusting their doctors, trusting the system, never realizing how quickly trust would curdle into dependence. The results were devastating. Tolerance built rapidly, requiring ever larger doses to achieve the same relief. Patients who tried to stop found themselves in the grip of withdrawal. Nausea, sweating, muscle cramps, restless nights, and a gnawing desperation that could not be silenced without another pill. What had begun as treatment slipped quietly into compulsion. The cycle was all too familiar. Medicine, pleasure, dependency, ruin. Replayed not in dens but in suburban bedrooms, rural towns, and city apartments. Families watched loved ones deteriorate, not in the haze of smoke, but in the hollow-eyed desperation of prescription dependency. By the early 2000s, entire communities in America and beyond were reeling from addiction, fueled not by smugglers or syndicates, but by pharmacies and corporations. When prescriptions ran out or became too expensive, many turned to heroin once again. Dealers recognized the demand and flooded markets with cheap, potent supplies. What had once been portrayed as a scourge of urban ghettos now spread into rural counties and small towns, carried by the very people who had first become dependent through legal medicine. Overdose deaths rose sharply, morgues filled, and politicians scrambled for answers. The boundaries between legal and illegal blurred completely. The same chemical family linked the amber bottles in medicine cabinets to the syringes found beside bodies in alleyways. The poppy's descendants had never respected categories. They simply delivered dependency wherever they were invited. And then came fentanyl. Originally developed for surgical use, this synthetic opioid was dozens of times more potent than heroin, capable of overwhelming the body in micrograms. It was meant to be a precise tool in controlled medical settings, but traffickers quickly discovered its potential. Cheap to produce, easy to transport, and terrifyingly strong, fentanyl entered the black market disguised as heroin or mixed into counterfeit pills. Addicts who thought they were taking a familiar dose suddenly faced lethal concentrations. Overdose deaths surged to unprecedented levels, each year setting grim new records. The drug that had begun as a hospital anesthetic had become a street executioner, its potency magnifying the cycle of ruin beyond anything the world had seen before. Communities across North America, Europe, and beyond found themselves in the grip of a crisis with no easy remedy. Police raided dealers, governments sued pharmaceutical companies, and medical associations revised guidelines. But the damage was already done. Millions were dependent, thousands died each month, and families were left to navigate grief and stigma in silence. The epidemic revealed not only the dangers of the drugs themselves, but the failures of the systems that had enabled them. Corporations that placed profit above safety, regulators who looked the other way, and medical institutions that underestimated the power of the poppy's chemical children. The echoes of history were unmistakable. Every era had proclaimed that it had found the safe way to use opium. The Sumerians saw it as a joy plant, the Greeks as a rational medicine, the Victorians as a respectable household tonic, Bayer as a modern marvel, and pharmaceutical companies as a breakthrough in pain management. Every era repeated the same mistake, to imagine that the drug could be mastered, that dependency could be sidestepped, that relief could be had without ruin. And every era discovered the same truth, paid in bodies, families, and generations scarred by addiction. The names changed: laudanum, morphine, heroin, oxycodone, fentanyl, but the cycle remained stubbornly intact. Today, the opioid epidemic continues with no clear end in sight. Harm reduction programs, needle exchanges, and supervised injection sites have emerged in some cities, aiming not to erase the drug, but to reduce its collateral damage. Critics call these measures surrender, advocates call them compassion. Yet even as policy shifts, the fundamental problem persists. The poppy, whether in fields or laboratories, continues to offer its false promise of peace. The temptation remains irresistible, the relief undeniable, the destruction inevitable. Looking back across 5,000 years, it is hard not to marvel at the persistence of the poppy. From the Sumerians who called it the joy plant, to modern chemists who rebranded it as oxycodone or fentanyl, humanity has never been able to resist its promise. Every civilization believed it had found the safe way to use it, the controlled way, the enlightened way. Each time the same cycle unfolded: medicine, pleasure, dependency, ruin. The details changed, the instruments, the rituals, the languages, but the structure remained identical. Empires rose around the flower's resin, fortunes were built on its trade, and households quietly collapsed under its grip. To tell the history of opium is to tell the history of human appetite, ingenuity, and self-destruction bound together. The earliest tablets carved in Sumer described opium as a gift, a tool to soothe pain and silence cries. Egyptians placed jars of resin in tombs, hoping it would serve the dead as it had the living. Greeks and Romans catalogued it with the same confidence they applied to philosophy, prescribing it as though it were no different from honey or vinegar. Medieval apothecaries tucked it into jars behind their counters. Monks copied recipes that included its tinctures, and Renaissance alchemists dissolved it in alcohol and proclaimed it a miracle. By then the pattern was clear, but still it went unnoticed. Relief came first, ruin later. What mattered was that the relief worked in the moment. Empires proved no more resistant than individuals. The East India Company industrialized the poppy, stripping fields of food and replacing them with flowers destined for auction. Millions starved in Bengal while warehouses in Calcutta filled with resin bricks that could be shipped to Canton. Britain balanced its ledgers, restored its silver reserves, and congratulated itself on commercial genius. The Qing dynasty, meanwhile, discovered the price of indulgence, a smoking spread from courtiers to soldiers to peasants, corroding the strength of the empire from within. When China resisted, Britain responded not with shame, but with gunboats, enforcing narcotics at cannon point. The Opium Wars made plain the principle that commerce outweighed morality, that profit justified poison, that empires could rise on smoke even as societies collapsed under it. The images linger, Commissioner Lin Zexu watching chests of resin destroyed in Canton, only to see his empire bombarded into submission. The summer palace looted and burned by foreign troops who claimed the mantle of civilization. Hollow-eyed men sprawled in dens, pipes clutched in trembling hands, lamps glowing faintly as smoke drifted into silence. These were not accidents of history, but the logical consequences of a system that prized profit above life. The poppy bloomed in Bengal, and its smoke settled over Beijing, London, and San Francisco alike. The drug was not contained by borders. It spread wherever there was pain to be dulled or profit to be made, and there has never been a shortage of either. In Britain, laudanum bottles rested on mantelpieces, sipped by mothers, labourers, and poets alike. Children were dosed with soothing syrups, their cries silenced by tinctures of opium and alcohol. Writers like Coleridge and De Quincey confessed their dependencies in prose that romanticised as much as it warned, proof that even genius could not escape the flower's grip. Across the Atlantic, American apothecaries sold their own bottles, filling rural cupboards and urban pharmacies with morphine and potent medicines. The Civil War made morphine dependency a national condition. Soldiers' disease carried home from battlefield hospitals, where injections dulled agony but left men chained to their syringes. The 20th century brought prohibition, treaties, and rhetoric of war. Dens were raided, addicts jailed, smugglers pursued, yet every crackdown only reshaped the trade, rather than eliminating it. Syndicates discovered fortune in prohibition, moving narcotics across borders, distributing them in alleys and clubs. Heroin emerged as the next heir to the poppy, embraced by doctors, marketed by buyer, and then criminalized when it revealed itself as more destructive than anything before. Jazz musicians, hippies, veterans, punks, each generation found itself tempted by the haze of relief. Each generation discovered the cost. The cycle repeated with weary familiarity, even as governments assured their citizens that progress was being made. And in the end, modern chemistry only sharpened the blade. Prescription opioids arrived in amber bottles, endorsed by doctors, advertised as safe. Entire communities in America and beyond were swallowed by dependency, overdoses mounting until morgues overflowed. Families grieved in silence, stigma silenced conversation, and lawsuits piled up against corporations that had profited from human weakness. Fentanyl, cheap and potent, magnified the devastation, killing by the microgram, transforming every dose into a gamble with death. The opium story, once measured in pipes and tinctures, was now written in statistics of overdose deaths and in the faces of mourners at countless funerals. What remains most striking is not the novelty of these developments, but their repetition. At every stage, someone promised that this time would be different. This time, the drug was medicine, not vice. This time, it was safe, controlled, scientific. And each time, within a generation, the same pattern emerged. Dependency ignored until it was too widespread to conceal, lives destroyed while profits were counted, reforms arriving too late, and replacements advertised as solutions that proved to be the next wave of ruin. Humanity's memory has always been shorter than the poppy's patience. The flower does not forget, it only waits. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Not the image of opium as a healing gift or a civilized indulgence, but the reality of 5,000 years of bodies dulled into silence, empires enriched by smoke, and generations erased by a flower that never cured anything but pain in the moment before it hollowed everything else. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.